Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Authorities knew where her phone was. They knew the exact coordinates, the precise location where the device was pinging cell towers every few minutes. They had the data. They had the technology. They had everything they needed to find Lauren Miles before it was too late. But they weren't allowed to look. This contradiction would haunt Ashford Plains for years to come. It would change laws, reshape policies, and force an entire community to confront a simple, terrible truth. Sometimes the systems designed to protect us become the very things that fail us most catastrophically. Lauren Miles was 23 years old when she disappeared. She wasn't running from anything. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She was simply living her life in the quiet, unremarkable way that most young people do in small Midwestern cities. Ashford Plains wasn't the kind of place where terrible things happened. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names, where the biggest news story might be about the high school football team or the opening of a new coffee shop downtown. On the evening of October 14th, Lauren left her apartment to pick up groceries. It was a Tuesday. She had called her mother earlier that day, complaining about how empty her refrigerator was. "I literally have condiments and nothing else," she had said, laughing. Her mother had laughed too, remembering her own early days of living alone, those weeks when dinner consisted of whatever random ingredients happened to be on hand. Lauren drove to the Save More on Whitman Avenue, the same store she always went to. The parking lot cameras captured her arrival at 7:42 in the evening. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked completely normal. There was nothing in her movements, nothing in her expression that suggested she had any awareness of what was about to happen. Inside the store, she moved through the aisles with her cart, picking up bread, milk, pasta, vegetables. Another camera caught her in the produce section, examining avocados with the careful attention of someone who has been burned before by choosing fruit that looked perfect but turned out to be disappointingly unripe. She selected 3, placed them gently in her cart, and moved on. At 8:17, she checked out. The cashier who rang up her groceries would later tell investigators that Lauren had seemed perfectly fine. She was on her phone, the cashier said, but not in a worried way. She was smiling at something. "I remember thinking she seemed happy." Lauren paid, collected her bags, and walked out into the parking lot. The cameras showed her loading the groceries into the trunk of her silver Honda Civic. Then she got into the driver's seat. The timestamp read 8:21. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her mother tried calling at 9:30, just to chat, to see how her day had gone. The call went to voicemail. She tried again at 10. Voicemail. By 11, she was starting to feel the first flutter of concern, though she tried to rationalize it away. Lauren was a grown woman. She was probably out with friends. She had probably forgotten to charge her phone. There were a dozen reasonable explanations. But mothers know. Somewhere deep in that ancient part of the brain that connects parent to child, Lauren's mother knew something was wrong. By midnight, she was calling Lauren's friends. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. At 1 in the morning, she called the police. The initial response was measured, almost casual. A young woman who hadn't been heard from for a few hours wasn't technically a missing person yet. She might have gone somewhere unexpected. She might have stayed with a friend. The officer who took the call was polite, but not particularly concerned. "Let's give it until morning," he suggested. "If she hasn't turned up by then, come in and file a report." But Lauren's mother couldn't wait until morning. She drove to Lauren's apartment, used her spare key to let herself in. Everything was normal. Too normal. Lauren's purse wasn't there. Her phone wasn't there. But her laptop sat open on the kitchen table, still logged into her email. Her favorite jacket hung on the back of the bathroom door. The bed was made. At 6 in the morning, she returned to the police station. This time, they listened more carefully. A formal missing person report was filed. Lauren's photograph was distributed to patrol officers. Her car was entered into the database as a vehicle of interest. And then someone had an idea. Lauren's phone. Even if she wasn't answering it, even if it was turned off, the phone company would have records. They would know where it had last pinged a tower. They would have data. The request went through proper channels. The police contacted Lauren's cellular provider. They explained the situation. A young woman, missing for nearly 12 hours now, last seen leaving a grocery store. They needed her phone's location data. The cellular company's response was polite but firm. They couldn't provide that information without proper legal authorization. They would need a court order. It was policy. It was the law. The police started the process of obtaining that court order. But it was early morning. Judges weren't in their offices yet. Paperwork had to be filed. Procedures had to be followed. The system, designed to protect privacy rights, moved at its own careful pace. Hours passed. Lauren's friends began posting on social media. Have you seen this girl? Last seen at Save More on Whitman Avenue. Please share. The posts spread through Ashford Plains like ripples on water. Hundreds of people saw them. Dozens shared them. Everyone hoped. Everyone waited. The police, meanwhile, were doing everything they could within the constraints they faced. They reviewed the Save More security footage, noting the exact time Lauren left. They canvassed the area around the store, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. They checked hospitals, just in case she had been in an accident and was unable to identify herself. By noon, they had their court order. The cellular company complied immediately. The data came through within minutes. Lauren's phone had last pinged a tower near the industrial area on the eastern edge of Ashford Plains. The location was specific enough to narrow down to a few square blocks. Police units were dispatched immediately, but they were already too late. The area where Lauren's phone had pinged was a sprawl of warehouses and abandoned factories, the remnants of Ashford Plains manufacturing past. Most of the buildings stood empty now, their windows broken, their parking lots cracked and weedy. It was the kind of place people drove through quickly, the kind of place that existed in the peripheral vision of a city, noticed but not really seen. Officers spread out, searching methodically. It took them 3 hours to find her car. It was parked behind one of the abandoned warehouses, hidden from the road. The groceries were still in the trunk, spoiled now from sitting in the heat all day. They found Lauren 2 buildings away. The details of what happened to her don't need to be described in full. What matters is that she was gone. What matters is that those hours of delay, those hours spent waiting for paperwork and court orders while her phone's signal grew weaker and finally stopped altogether, those hours had made all the difference. Marcus Hale was arrested 4 days later. He was 29 years old, a former warehouse worker who had been laid off 6 months earlier when his employer relocated operations out of state. He had been living in one of the abandoned buildings, squatting in what used to be a foreman's office, surviving on odd jobs and petty theft. He had seen Lauren in the parking lot, had followed her, had forced her car off the road using his truck, had taken her to the warehouse. During his interrogation, Hale was asked why he chose her. He shrugged. She was alone, he said. Wrong place, wrong time. The investigation revealed that if police had been able to access Lauren's phone data immediately, they would have found her within hours of her disappearance. The warehouse where Hale had taken her was less than 15 minutes from the police station. The technology existed. The capability existed. But the legal framework required waiting, required procedures, required time that Lauren didn't have. Her funeral was held on a gray October morning. Hundreds of people attended. Her mother stood at the front of the church, her face blank with grief, and said something that would echo through Ashford Plains for months to come. My daughter died in the gap between knowing and being allowed to act, she said. We knew where she was. We just weren't allowed to look. The local news picked up the story, then the regional news, then the national media. Lauren Miles became a name that people across the country recognized. A symbol of the sometimes fatal disconnect between technology and law, between capability and permission. Lawmakers took notice. In Ashford Plains, in the state capital, in Washington, D.C., people began asking questions. How many cases like this existed? How many people had died because emergency data was locked behind legal procedures designed for different circumstances? A bill was introduced in the state legislature. It was called Lauren's Law. It created an emergency exception to standard privacy protections, allowing law enforcement to access cellular location data in cases of imminent danger without waiting for a court order. The data access would be temporary. It would be logged. It would be reviewable, but it would be immediate. The bill passed unanimously. Similar laws began appearing in other states. The precedent spread. The legal landscape shifted, shaped by the absence of a 23-year-old woman who had just wanted to buy groceries. Marcus Hale was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, he showed no emotion. Lauren's mother was there. She looked at him directly and said, "You took my daughter, but she changed the world more than you ever will." The judge agreed. In his remarks, he noted that while justice had been served in this courtroom, the real victory was the systematic change that Lauren's death had sparked. "This young woman's legacy," he said, "will be measured in the lives saved by the laws created in her name." But for Lauren's mother, for her father, for her friends, and everyone who loved her, those words offered only cold comfort. The system had changed. The gap had been closed. But Lauren was still gone, buried in a cemetery on the north side of Ashford Plains, her gravestone simple and heartbreaking. Beloved daughter, friend, and catalyst for change. The story of Lauren Miles taught Ashford Plains something it hadn't fully understood before. Systems, no matter how well-intentioned, are only as good as their ability to respond when seconds matter. Privacy protections are important. Legal procedures are important. But so is the recognition that sometimes, waiting for permission means waiting too long. Lauren was gone. But the system she exposed was still alive, still evolving, still trying to find the balance between rights and response, between protection and action. Her story was just the beginning. 3,000 miles away, in a coastal city where the ocean met crumbling colonial architecture, another story was unfolding. Puerto Loma sat on the edge of a continent, a place where languages mixed and cultures blended, where modern high-rises stood blocks away from centuries-old churches. It was beautiful in the way that complicated places often are, full of contradictions and history and the constant sound of the sea. Elena Vargas lived on the 4th floor of an apartment building in the San Miguel district. She was 31 years old, a graphic designer who worked mostly from home, creating logos and websites for small businesses throughout the city. Her neighbors knew her as quiet and polite, the kind of person who always held the elevator door and smiled when you passed her in the hallway. She had been married for 3 years. Her husband, Daniel, worked in finance, traveling frequently for meetings with clients in other cities. They seemed happy enough. They didn't fight loudly. They didn't cause problems. They were simply another young couple trying to build a life in an expensive city where rent consumed most of their income, and savings seemed like a distant dream. On the morning of March 7th, the building's superintendent found Elena's door ajar. This was unusual. Elena was careful about security, always making sure the door was locked, always checking the peephole before opening it to anyone. The superintendent knocked. No answer. He called out. Nothing. He pushed the door open slowly. Elena was lying in the living room. There was blood. Not everywhere, but enough. Enough to make it immediately clear that something terrible had happened. The superintendent backed out of the apartment and called the police. They arrived within minutes. The initial assessment was quick, almost perfunctory. The apartment showed signs of disturbance. A lamp was knocked over. A chair was on its side. Elena's purse was missing. Her laptop was gone. The lead detective on the scene was a veteran named Cordero. He had seen hundreds of crime scenes over his career. This one, he told his partner, looked straightforward. Robbery, he said. She came home, interrupted someone, they panicked. The medical examiner's preliminary report supported this theory. Elena had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The pattern suggested a struggle, an escalation of violence that hadn't been planned. The kind of thing that happens when a robbery goes wrong. Within 6 hours of finding the body, police had their official statement. Elena Vargas had been the victim of a robbery that turned violent. They were searching for suspects. Anyone with information should come forward. Case closed, essentially. Or so it seemed. Elena's family didn't believe it. Her sister, Camila, arrived at the police station the next morning. She was carrying a folder full of documents. Text messages, emails, screenshots of social media conversations. You need to look at these, she told Detective Cordero. This wasn't a robbery. Cordero was patient but skeptical. Families often struggled to accept the randomness of violence. They looked for meaning, for motive, for someone to blame beyond the cruel lottery of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Camila was insistent. My sister's marriage was falling apart, she said. Daniel was having an affair. She was planning to leave him. They fought about money constantly. Cordero looked through the documents. The text messages showed tension, certainly. Arguments about bills, about Daniel's travel schedule, about things that every married couple argues about. but nothing that seemed to point toward murder. With respect, Cordero said, marital problems are common. That doesn't mean. She told me she was afraid of him. Camila interrupted. 2 weeks ago, she said he'd been acting strange. Aggressive. Did she report this to anyone? No. She was embarrassed. She thought maybe she was overreacting. Cordero made notes, but his expression remained neutral. We'll look into it, he promised. Over the next few days, more family members came forward with their concerns. Elena's mother insisted that Daniel had always been controlling, that he monitored Elena's movements, that he got angry when she spent time with her friends or family. Elena's cousin claimed that Daniel had gambling debts, that he owed money to dangerous people. The media picked up on the family's accusations. Suddenly, the story wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. It was a potential domestic murder, a husband eliminating his wife. Daniel gave an interview to a local television station. He looked devastated, his eyes red from crying. I love my wife, he said. We had problems, yes. What couple doesn't? But I would never hurt her. Never. He had an alibi. On the night of Elena's death, he had been in Montevideo for a business conference. His hotel records confirmed it. Security footage showed him in the lobby of the conference center. He couldn't have been in Puerto Loma, but the family wasn't satisfied. He hired someone, Camila said publicly. He paid someone to kill her. The police investigated this possibility. They looked into Daniel's finances. They interviewed his colleagues. They traced his movements in the weeks leading up to Elena's death. They found nothing that suggested he had hired a killer. And yet, doubt remained. The surveillance footage from Elena's building showed something interesting. On the evening of her death, 3 people had entered the building who didn't live there. One was a food delivery driver, confirmed by his uniform and the order receipt. Another was a woman visiting her boyfriend on the 2nd floor. The third was a man in a dark jacket who entered at 6:47 in the evening and left at 7:21. The cameras didn't capture his face clearly. The angle was wrong, the lighting poor. But his movements were confident. He knew where he was going. He didn't hesitate or look around like someone who was lost. He went straight to the elevator. Elena's apartment was on the 4th floor. The elevator footage showed the man pressing the button for the 4th floor. Then the footage had a gap. The camera had malfunctioned for exactly 18 minutes, from 7:03 to 7:21. When it came back online, the elevator was empty. This gap felt significant. Too convenient. Too precise. The building's security company was questioned. Was the camera malfunction real, or could it have been caused deliberately? The technician who examined the system said it was impossible to tell. These cameras are old, he said. They glitch all the time. Detective Cordero stood in Elena's apartment a week after her death, trying to see what the initial assessment might have missed. The apartment had been cleaned by a professional service hired by the landlord, eager to rent the space again. But Cordero walked through it anyway, visualizing the scene. If this was a robbery, why take only the laptop and purse? Why not take the television, the sound system, the jewelry box that sat in plain sight on the bedroom dresser? If the thief was surprised by Elena coming home, why would they have time to grab specific items, but not just run? And if this was a hired killing, why make it look like a robbery at all? Professional killers didn't usually stage scenes. They did the job and left. Unless, Cordero thought, the staging was part of the job. Make it look like a robbery. Make it look random. Give the husband an alibi. He requested phone records for Daniel's cell. The records showed normal activity. Calls to colleagues. Calls to his hotel. Nothing suspicious. But there was a pattern that caught Cordero's attention. In the 3 months before Elena's death, Daniel had received calls from a prepaid phone number. The calls were brief, never more than a minute or two. The prepaid number was never used to call anyone else. Cordero tried to trace the prepaid phone. It had been purchased with cash at a convenience store. The store's security footage from that date had been recorded over weeks ago. Dead end. Camila organized a press conference. She stood in front of reporters with her family behind her and said, "We know Daniel killed our sister. Maybe he didn't hold the weapon, but he arranged it. He orchestrated it. And the police are letting him get away with it." Daniel responded with his own press conference. His lawyer stood beside him, advising him to say nothing, but Daniel insisted. "I am not a murderer," he said, his voice shaking with either grief or anger or both. "I loved Elena. I will grieve her for the rest of my life. These accusations are destroying me." Public opinion fractured. Some people believed the family. The circumstances were too suspicious, they said. The husband always does it. Others believed Daniel. He had an alibi. There was no evidence. Grief was making the family irrational. The investigation continued for months. Every lead ended in uncertainty. Every piece of evidence could be interpreted two ways. The man in the dark jacket on the surveillance footage was never identified. The prepaid phone calls remained unexplained, but not necessarily incriminating. Eventually, without enough evidence to charge anyone, the case went cold. Not officially closed, but no longer active. Elena's family held vigils. They posted on social media, keeping her memory alive, keeping pressure on the police to do more. Daniel moved away from Puerto Loma. He sold the apartment, sold most of his possessions, and relocated to another country entirely. Some saw this as the action of a guilty man fleeing judgment. Others saw it as a grieving widower trying to escape the constant accusations and scrutiny. The truth, whatever it was, remained elusive. Elena was gone. The circumstances of her death sat in that uncomfortable space between suspicious and provable, between intuition and evidence. Detective Cordero retired 2 years later. In his final interview with a local newspaper, he was asked about unsolved cases that haunted him. He mentioned Elena Vargas. "I don't know what happened in that apartment," he admitted. "I have theories. We all do. But theories aren't justice. And her family deserves more than theories. Sometimes justice doesn't fail loudly. Sometimes it doesn't fail with dramatic courtroom acquittals or obvious corruption. Sometimes it just fades, gradually and quietly, until a case becomes another file in storage, another name that fewer and fewer people remember." Elena Vargas remained a mystery. Her family remained convinced. Daniel remained free. And in Puerto Loma, when people told stories about unsolved crimes, about cases that went wrong, her name always came up. Not as a warning, exactly. More as a reminder that sometimes there are no satisfying answers. Sometimes the truth fractures into multiple versions, and no amount of investigation can piece it back together into something solid and certain. The case taught something important about the nature of justice. It isn't always a clear verdict. It isn't always resolution. Sometimes it's just the effort itself, the refusal to forget, the insistence that a life mattered even when the circumstances of its ending remained disputed. Elena's sister Camila continued to post about her every year on the anniversary of her death. The posts got fewer likes over time, fewer comments, as public attention drifted to newer tragedies and more recent mysteries. But Camila kept posting, kept remembering, kept insisting that her sister's death meant something more than the official report suggested. And maybe that persistence was its own kind of justice. Not the kind handed down from a judge, not the kind that comes with prison sentences and closed case files, but the kind that refuses to let someone be forgotten, refuses to let uncertainty become indifference. In Puerto Loma, the ocean keeps moving against the shore. The colonial buildings keep standing. Life continues with all its contradictions. And somewhere in the city records, in a filing cabinet in the police headquarters, Elena Vargas's case file sits waiting for evidence that may never come. Mara Whitfield had always wanted to see the world through a camera lens. Not the sanitized, staged version that appeared in travel magazines, but the real texture of daily life. The weathered hands of a street vendor arranging fruit. The light filtering through laundry hanging between apartment buildings. The expression on a grandmother's face as she watched children play in a dusty plaza. At 27, Mara had saved enough money from her work as a freelance photographer to fund 6 months of solo travel. Her plan was loose, intentional in its flexibility. She would go where opportunities led her, stay in places until they stopped revealing new stories, then move on. No schedules, no tours, just her camera, and the generous patience of strangers willing to let her document their worlds. Carsava was supposed to be a brief stop. The city sat at a cultural crossroads, a place where East met West in architecture and food and the cadence of conversation on street corners. Mara arrived on a Thursday evening in late September, checked into a small guest house run by a woman named Eileen, and spent her first night planning the next day's shooting schedule. She loved the golden hour, that brief window before sunset when everything glowed with warm light. The next morning, she woke early, drank the strong coffee Eileen prepared, and spent the day walking through Carsava's old quarter, taking photographs of doorways and shadows and the way light moved across ancient stone walls. Her Instagram posts from those first few days showed a young woman completely in her element. She was smiling in selfies taken in front of ornate fountains. She was crouched low to capture the perfect angle of a cat sleeping in a window. She was happy. She messaged her parents regularly. "This place is incredible," she wrote. "The people are so kind. I could stay here for weeks." Her father joked back, "Just remember to come home eventually." "I promise," Mara replied. "This isn't goodbye, just see you later." On her fifth evening in Karsava, Mara told Eileen that she wanted to photograph the old textile market as it closed for the day. She liked capturing the transition between workday and evening, the way vendors packed up their goods and street lights flickered on and the energy of a place shifted. "Be careful," Eileen said. "That area is safe, but stay on the main streets." Mara promised she would. She left the guest house at 6:30, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, wearing comfortable walking shoes and carrying a small bottle of water. Eileen watched her go, thinking nothing of it. Mara had been cautious all week, aware that as a solo female traveler she needed to be smart about where she went and when. The textile market was exactly what Mara had hoped for. Vendors called out final prices. Shoppers haggled over lengths of bright fabric. The air smelled like dye and dust and the diesel fumes from delivery trucks. She moved through the crowds, taking photographs, occasionally asking permission with gestures and smiles when language barriers prevented actual conversation. She posted a photo to Instagram at 7:48. It showed bolts of silk in jewel tones, the caption reading, "Color everywhere." That was the last post she ever made. When Mara didn't return to the guest house by midnight, Eileen began to worry. When she still hadn't returned by 2 in the morning, Eileen called the police. The officer who answered took down the information but didn't sound particularly concerned. "She's probably met some other travelers," he suggested. "Young people lose track of time." But by morning, when Mara still hadn't appeared, Eileen went to the police station in person. This time, they listened more carefully. A missing foreign tourist was a serious matter. It could become an international incident. It could affect tourism. It needed to be handled properly. The investigation began immediately. Police went to the textile market, asking vendors if they remembered seeing a young Western woman with a camera. Several did. She had been friendly, they said, polite. She had taken photographs and smiled, and seemed to be enjoying herself. No one remembered seeing her leave. Her camera was never found. Neither was her bag. It was as if Mara had simply dissolved into the evening crowd and never emerged. Back home, Mara's parents received a call from the U.S. Embassy. Their daughter was missing. Authorities in Karsava were searching. They should prepare to travel if necessary. The news hit them like a physical blow. Their daughter, their careful, smart daughter who sent regular updates and always checked in, was gone. Simply gone. Within 48 hours, Mara's disappearance was international news. Major outlets picked up the story. Her photograph, smiling and full of life, appeared on television screens across the world. The narrative practically wrote itself. Young American woman vanishes in foreign city. The coverage brought pressure. The U.S. State Department got involved. Diplomats contacted their counterparts in Karsava's government. Resources were mobilized. The search intensified. But the coverage also brought something else, speculation. Online forums filled with theories. Maybe Mara had been kidnapped by human traffickers. Maybe she had been targeted because she was American. Maybe she had gone somewhere willingly and something had gone wrong. Maybe she had been murdered by extremists. Maybe. The speculation took on ugly tones. Some people suggested Mara had been reckless, that solo female travel was inherently dangerous, that she should have known better than to be out alone after dark in a foreign country. Others pushed back, arguing that blaming the victim was exactly the wrong response. In Karsava, the public reaction was different. Many locals were offended by the international coverage, which portrayed their city as dangerous and backward. "We are not savages," one newspaper editorial read. "This is a tragedy, yes, but tragedies happen everywhere. Don't use this woman's disappearance to demonize our entire culture." Tensions rose. What should have been a collaborative search effort became tangled in cultural defensiveness and international politics. Meanwhile, Mara's parents arrived in Karsava. They met with police officials. They met with embassy representatives. They walked the streets their daughter had walked, trying to understand what had happened, trying to find any trace of her. Her mother gave a press conference, her voice breaking. "Please," she said. "If anyone knows anything, if anyone saw anything, please come forward. We just want to bring our daughter home." The investigation was being led by a detective named Osman Kaya. He was in his 50s, methodical and quiet, someone who believed in evidence rather than theories. While the media circus swirled around him, while international pressure mounted and amateur sleuths online declared they had solved the case, Kaya focused on the details that mattered. He obtained security camera footage from every business near the textile market. He interviewed hundreds of people. He mapped Mara's movements through the market with painstaking precision, establishing a timeline of exactly where she had been and when. The last confirmed sighting placed her at the eastern edge of the market at approximately 8:15. A fruit vendor remembered her because she had photographed his display and then bought an orange from him. "She peeled it right there and ate it," he said. "She was happy." After that, nothing. No cameras caught her. No one remembered seeing her. But Kaya noticed something. The eastern edge of the market was near a loading area where delivery trucks parked. During the evening, when vendors were packing up, several trucks would have been present. He began tracking down the drivers of every truck that had been in that area on the evening Mara disappeared. Most of them checked out quickly. They had delivery records, witnesses who could confirm their movements. But one truck, a small flatbed used for hauling construction materials, had no clear documentation for that evening. The truck belonged to a company, but the driver who usually used it wasn't scheduled to work that day. Kaya dug deeper. He found that the truck had been taken without authorization by a day laborer named Kemal Aaron. Kemal was 23, someone who picked up occasional work at construction sites around Karsava. He lived in a one-room apartment on the outskirts of the city. When Kaya went to question Kemal, the young man wasn't home. His landlord said he hadn't seen him in several days. Alarm bells went off. An alert was issued for Kemal Aaron. His photograph was distributed to all police units. Within hours, he was spotted at a bus station, attempting to leave the city. He was arrested without incident. During the initial interrogation, Kemal denied everything. He didn't know anything about a missing tourist. He hadn't been near the textile market. He had taken the truck because he needed to move some furniture for a friend. He was leaving town to visit his family in a rural village. But Kaya was patient. He had Kemal's phone records, which showed he had been in the area of the textile market that evening. He had footage from a camera at a gas station showing the company's truck being filled up around 9 that night. The timestamp and location didn't match Kemal's story about helping a friend move furniture. Hour by hour, the lies unraveled. Finally, after 8 hours of interrogation, Kemal broke. Yes, he admitted. He had seen the American woman. She had been alone, focused on her camera, not paying attention to her surroundings. He had watched her for a while, following her through the market as the crowds thinned. When she moved toward the loading area, away from the main streets, he had approached her. His initial intention, he claimed, had been to rob her. The camera equipment looked expensive. Tourists always had cash. But when he grabbed her bag, she had fought back. She had screamed. He had panicked. He hit her. She fell. He hit her again to make her stop screaming. And then she wasn't moving anymore. He had put her body in the truck and driven out of the city. In the hills north of Karsava, there were abandoned quarries, places where mining companies had dug into the earth decades ago, and then left behind deep pits filled with water. He had weighted her body with rocks and pushed her into one of these flooded quarries. The confession was detailed, specific, and it led police directly to Mara Whitfield's body. The recovery operation took 2 days. Divers descended into the cold, murky water of the quarry. When they brought Mara to the surface, her parents identified her through a birthmark on her shoulder. The camera she had loved was never recovered. Neither were most of her possessions. Kemal had sold what he could and discarded the rest. The international media, which had spent days speculating about human trafficking rings and terrorist connections, now had their answer. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a grand plot. It was something devastatingly simple. A young man who wanted money saw an opportunity. A moment of violence spiraled beyond his control. A life ended because someone made a terrible choice. Mara's parents released a statement. They thanked the police in Karsava for their work. They thanked Detective Kaya by name. They asked the media to stop speculating, to stop creating narratives that weren't grounded in fact. Their daughter's death was tragedy enough without being turned into entertainment or political commentary. The funeral was held back in the United States. Hundreds of people attended. Mara's photographs were displayed on screens throughout the church, a slideshow of the beauty she had captured during her travels. Street scenes from a dozen countries. Faces of strangers who had let her into their lives for a moment. Light and shadow and color. Her father spoke about how Mara had always seen the world as fundamentally good. She trusted people, he said. She believed in kindness. What happened to her doesn't mean she was wrong to believe those things. It means one person made an evil choice. One person, not the world. In Karsava, Kemal Aaron was tried and convicted of murder. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. His own confession was detailed enough that there could be no doubt. He was sentenced to life in prison. During the sentencing, the judge addressed him directly. "You killed a young woman who came to our city in peace," he said. "You killed her for objects that could be replaced. You killed her, and then you tried to erase her existence by hiding her body where no one would find it. You have brought shame to this city and sorrow to a family who will never recover from your actions." Kemal showed little emotion throughout the trial. When asked if he had anything to say, he shook his head. No remorse was expressed. No apology was offered. For Detective Kaya, the case became the defining investigation of his career. Not because it was complex or because it required brilliant deduction, but because of what it represented. In the midst of international pressure, media speculation, and cultural tension, he had simply done the work. He had followed the evidence. He had been methodical and thorough, and that basic, unglamorous police work had brought answers. In an interview months later, he was asked about the speculation that had dominated the early days of the investigation. All those theories about organized crime and terrorism and elaborate plots. People want complicated explanations, Kaya said. They want the story to be dramatic. But most crimes are not complicated. They're simple. Someone makes a choice. That choice has consequences. Our job is to connect those dots with evidence, not imagination. The case also changed something in how missing person investigations involving tourists were handled in Karsava. New protocols were established. Faster response times. Better coordination between local police and international authorities. Cultural sensitivity training for officers who would be interfacing with foreign families. Mara's death had sparked anger and fear and speculation. But in its aftermath, it also sparked improvement. The systems designed to help people in danger became more responsive, more efficient. Not because of political pressure or international demands, but because the people doing the work saw the gaps and chose to fill them. Eileen, the guest house owner who had hosted Mara during her last days, struggled with guilt for months. She replayed their final conversation over and over. Should she have insisted Mara not go out alone? Should she have warned her more forcefully about specific areas to avoid? But Mara's mother contacted her directly. They spoke on the phone for nearly an hour. "You were kind to my daughter," Mara's mother said. "She was happy in your guest house. She felt safe. What happened to her wasn't because you failed to protect her. It was because one person made an evil choice. Don't carry that weight. Please." The conversation helped Eileen, though the sadness remained. She kept Mara's photograph on the wall of the guest house. When new guests asked about it, she would tell them about the young photographer who had loved Karsava's light and colors. She made sure Mara was remembered as someone who had lived fully, not just as someone who had died tragically. In the years that followed, Mara's parents established a foundation in her name. It provided grants to young photographers pursuing projects that documented cultures and communities around the world. The application asked candidates to describe not just what they wanted to photograph, but why it mattered. Mara believed that photography could create understanding. The foundation's mission statement read, she believed that showing people's daily lives, their joys and struggles, could build empathy across borders. We want to continue that work. Dozens of photographers received grants in Mara's name. Their work appeared in magazines and exhibitions. They told stories about communities that rarely made headlines, about ordinary people living extraordinary lives, about beauty existing in unexpected places. Each project carried a small credit line, made possible by the Mara Whitfield Memorial Foundation. Her legacy became bigger than her death. It became about what she had valued, what she had pursued, what she had believed art could accomplish. But for her parents, no amount of good work or positive legacy could fill the absence. Their daughter's empty chair at the dinner table, the grandchildren they would never have, the phone calls that would never come, the photographs she would never take. They marked each anniversary of her death quietly, privately. They visited her grave and left flowers. They looked through her photographs, thousands of images stored on hard drives, and remembered the person behind the camera. The world moved on, as it always does. Karsava continued to attract tourists. The textile market remained a popular destination. Life continued with all its complexity and beauty and danger. But in the flooded quarry where Mara's body had been hidden, someone placed a small memorial. Just a simple stone with her name and dates carved into it. It wasn't official. It wasn't sanctioned by any authority. Someone who remembered, who cared, had put it there. And sometimes, hikers exploring the hills would find it. They would read the name and dates and wonder about the story. Some would search online and learn what had happened. And they would stand there for a moment, looking out over the water, thinking about how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change, how a person could wake up one morning full of plans and dreams and be gone by evening. The memorial stone weathered over time. Rain and wind wore at the carved letters. But it remained, a quiet marker, a reminder, not of how Mara Whitfield died, but that she had lived, that she had mattered, that she was still remembered. In the grand scheme of justice, Kemal Aaron's conviction was straightforward. Clear evidence, clear guilt, clear punishment. But justice for Mara's family was more complicated. They had answers, yes. They knew what happened. They knew who did it. They knew he was in prison. But they would never have their daughter back. They would never see her grow older, never watch her build a career, never know who she might have become. That hole couldn't be filled by any verdict or any sentence. It could only be lived with, day after day, in the company of memories and photographs and the weight of permanent absence. The story of Mara Whitfield taught something important about the limits of justice. It can provide answers. It can provide accountability. It can remove dangerous people from society. But it cannot restore what was lost. It cannot heal grief. It cannot make things the way they were before. All it can do is acknowledge that something wrong occurred and attempt to balance the scales in whatever limited ways the law allows. For Mara's parents, that acknowledgement mattered. The knowledge that Kemal was in prison, that he couldn't hurt anyone else, that he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he did, provided some measure of peace. But peace was not the same as happiness. It was not the same as healing. It was simply the quiet acceptance that this was how things were now. Their daughter was gone. The person responsible was caught. Life would continue, and they would carry their grief with them, every day, for the rest of their lives. Detective Kaya retired 3 years after solving Mara's case. In his farewell speech to the department, he mentioned her investigation specifically. "It taught me," he said, "that our work matters beyond the immediate case. How we conduct ourselves, how we treat families, how we pursue truth rather than convenient narratives, it all matters. That young woman's parents trusted us to find answers. We owed them nothing less than our absolute best effort. I hope I gave them that." The officers in attendance applauded. Many of them had worked on the investigation. They remembered the pressure, the media circus, the difficulty of conducting methodical police work while the world watched and speculated. They also remembered the moment when they found Mara's body. The sadness of that day. The way it felt to tell her parents. The weight of standing at the quarry and understanding that this was where a young woman's dreams had ended. Those memories stayed with them, shaping how they approached every case that followed. For 1,000 miles away, in a medium-sized American city, something very different was unfolding. Riverview Medical Center sat on a hill overlooking the downtown area, a sprawling complex of buildings that had grown over decades to accommodate the region's healthcare needs. It was a good hospital, by all accounts. Well-staffed, well-equipped, the kind of place where people felt safe bringing their families when illness struck. Caleb Norton worked on the 4th floor, in the cardiac care unit. He had been a nurse there for 6 years. His colleagues described him as quiet but competent. Patients often praised him in their feedback forms. "Nurse Caleb was so gentle," one review read. "He made my mother comfortable during a very difficult time." He was 32 years old, unmarried, living alone in a small apartment 15 minutes from the hospital. His life seemed unremarkable in the way that many lives are. He went to work. He came home. He watched television. He occasionally went out for dinner with coworkers, though he usually declined invitations to larger social gatherings. If you had asked his supervisor to describe him, she would have said he was reliable, always on time, never complained, did his job without drama or fuss. The kind of employee every manager hopes for. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Caleb Norton was killing patients. Not many at first. One here, one there, spread out over months. Always patients who were already seriously ill. Always patients whose deaths wouldn't seem suspicious given their medical conditions. Heart attack victims who had second arrests. Stroke patients whose conditions deteriorated. Cancer patients whose bodies finally gave up the fight. The deaths were noted in charts. Families grieved. Funerals were held. And the hospital continued its work, saving lives and losing others in the natural rhythm of medical care. But the rhythm wasn't entirely natural. The first person to notice something odd was Dr. Patricia Chun, a cardiologist who had been at Riverview for 15 years. She was reviewing patient outcomes for a quality improvement project when she noticed a pattern. The cardiac unit had a slightly higher than expected mortality rate for certain types of cases. Not dramatically higher, just enough to be statistically noticeable. She mentioned it to her department head. "It's probably nothing," she said. "Small sample size, natural variation. But I thought someone should know." The department head looked at the data. He agreed it was likely nothing, but decided to have the quality assurance team do a deeper review. Best to be thorough. The quality assurance review took 3 months. It involved looking at hundreds of patient files, examining outcomes, comparing Riverview statistics to national averages and to other hospitals in the region. The conclusion was that while the cardiac unit's mortality rate was slightly elevated, it wasn't outside the bounds of normal variation. The patients who died had been seriously ill. Their deaths, while sad, were explainable by their medical conditions. Case closed. Except Dr. Chin couldn't quite let it go. She started paying more attention to the deaths in her unit. Not in an official capacity, just as someone who had developed an instinct for when something felt wrong. She noticed that many of the unexpected deaths occurred during the night shift. This made sense, in a way. Night shifts were understaffed. Patients were more vulnerable. If someone's condition was going to deteriorate, it often happened in those quiet hours before dawn. But there was another pattern. Many of the deaths occurred when Caleb Norton was the assigned nurse. Again, this could be coincidence. Caleb often worked nights. He often cared for the sickest patients. It would make sense that he would be present for more deaths than nurses who worked different shifts or with less critical patients. Dr. Chin told herself she was being paranoid. There was no reason to suspect Caleb of anything. He was a good nurse. Patients liked him. His documentation was thorough, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She started reviewing the specific cases of patients who died unexpectedly on Caleb's shifts. She looked at their vital signs in the hours before death. She examined the medications they had received. She looked for any abnormalities. In most cases, she found nothing alarming. Patients deteriorated in ways that were consistent with their underlying conditions. But in a few cases, something seemed off. A patient would be stable, then suddenly crash in ways that didn't quite fit the expected progression of their illness. She brought her concerns to the chief of medicine. "I think we should look more carefully at some of these deaths," she said. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I just think something might be wrong." The chief of medicine was skeptical. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I don't know," Dr. Chin admitted. "That's why we need to investigate." The chief of medicine was in a difficult position. Launching an investigation without clear evidence could destroy reputations, create panic, and expose the hospital to lawsuits. But ignoring a doctor's concerns about patient deaths was equally problematic. He decided on a compromise. He asked the hospital's risk management department to quietly review the cases Dr. Chun had flagged. No accusations would be made. No one would be told they were under investigation. It would simply be a careful, confidential review. The risk management review took 2 months. During that time, 3 more patients died unexpectedly in the cardiac unit. All 3 had Caleb Norton as their nurse. The reviewers looked at medications. They looked at procedures. They looked at everything that could possibly explain the deaths. And they kept coming back to one thing. In several of the cases, patients had received insulin injections that weren't documented in their charts. Insulin, when given to someone who doesn't need it, can cause blood sugar to drop to dangerous levels. It can cause organ failure. It can cause death. And it's very difficult to detect after the fact, especially if no one is looking for it. The evidence was circumstantial. There were no witnesses to Caleb injecting patients with unauthorized insulin. There were no cameras in patient rooms. There was no confession. But the pattern was undeniable. Patients under Caleb's care died at higher rates than patients under other nurses' care. Some of those patients showed signs of hypoglycemia before death, and Caleb had access to insulin as part of his normal duties. The hospital called the police. Detective Raymond Torres took the case. He had worked medical malpractice cases before, but never something like this. The idea that a nurse might be intentionally killing patients was almost incomprehensible. His first step was to interview Caleb Norton. This had to be done carefully. If Caleb was innocent, accusing him would be devastating. If he was guilty, they needed to give him enough rope to hang himself. Torres and his partner arrived at Caleb's apartment on a Wednesday morning. Caleb answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly having just woken up after a night shift. "Mr. Norton, I'm Detective Torres. Can we come in? We need to ask you some questions about the hospital." Caleb looked confused but not alarmed. "Is something wrong? We just need to clarify some things. May we come in?" Caleb stepped aside. The apartment was neat, almost obsessively so. Everything in its place. No clutter. No personality. It felt like a space someone occupied but didn't really live in. They sat in the small living room. Torres began with softball questions. How long had Caleb been a nurse? Did he enjoy his work? What was it like working in the cardiac unit? Caleb answered easily. Yes, he enjoyed nursing. It was rewarding to help people. The cardiac unit was challenging, but he felt like he was making a difference. Then Torres shifted. "We've noticed that several patients have died unexpectedly on your shifts. Can you help us understand why that might be?" Caleb's expression didn't change. "I often work with the sickest patients," he said. "I think I get assigned the difficult cases because I'm experienced." "That makes sense," Torres agreed. "But some of these patients weren't expected to die. Their families are asking questions." "People die in hospitals," Caleb said. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "It's sad, but it happens. I did everything I could for each patient." Torres let the silence stretch. In interrogations, silence is a tool. People feel compelled to fill it, and in filling it, they sometimes say more than they intended. But Caleb just sat there, looking at Torres with patient curiosity, waiting for the next question. Torres tried a different approach. "We found some irregularities with insulin administration. Can you walk me through your procedures for handling insulin?" "I follow hospital protocol," Caleb said. "Insulin is documented every time it's administered. The patient's blood sugar is checked first. Everything is recorded. But what if someone wanted to give insulin without documenting it? Would that be possible?" Caleb tilted his head slightly. "I suppose anything is possible. But why would someone do that? You tell me." Caleb smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it made Torres' skin crawl. "I wouldn't know, Detective. I follow the rules." The interview continued for another hour. Torres asked the same questions in different ways. He probed for inconsistencies. He watched Caleb's body language for any sign of stress or deception. Caleb remained unervingly calm throughout. Finally, Torres decided to be direct. "Mr. Norton, we believe you may have been involved in the deaths of several patients. We're going to need you to come to the station for further questioning." Caleb stood up. "Am I under arrest?" "Not at this time, but we strongly encourage you to cooperate." "I think I should call a lawyer," Caleb said. That was the end of the interview. Torres left frustrated. He had hoped to get Caleb talking, hoped the man would make a mistake or let something slip. But Caleb had been too controlled, too careful. The investigation intensified. Police obtained warrants for Caleb's phone records, his bank statements, his internet search history. They interviewed every nurse and doctor who had worked with him. They talked to patients' families, asking if they remembered anything unusual about Caleb's care. Most people had nothing but positive things to say. He was kind, they said, attentive. He seemed to genuinely care about the patients. But a few people remembered small odd things. One family member recalled Caleb being in the patient's room late at night, when there was no clear reason for him to be there. Another remembered him giving an injection and then leaving quickly without explaining what it was for. None of this was proof. All of it was concerning. Meanwhile, the hospital suspended Caleb pending the investigation. He couldn't work. He couldn't enter the building. His access to all hospital systems was revoked. He hired a lawyer, a defense attorney named Michael Brennan, who specialized in medical malpractice cases. Brennan's advice was simple. Say nothing. Admit nothing. Make the police prove their case. For weeks, the investigation seemed stalled. The evidence was circumstantial. Without a confession or witnesses, prosecutors weren't sure they could get a conviction. Then investigators got access to Caleb's personal laptop. In his internet search history, going back years, they found searches for insulin overdoses, for symptoms of hypoglycemia, for how long insulin remained detectable in a body after death, for famous cases of medical professionals who killed patients. They found journal entries describing his feelings of power when patients died under his care, descriptions of watching the life fade from someone's eyes, reflections on who deserved to live and who didn't. It was all there. A detailed record of his thoughts, his motivations, his kills. The journal entries were chilling in their calm rationality. Caleb didn't write like someone consumed by rage or madness. He wrote like someone documenting a hobby. Each entry was dated, organized, methodical. February 12th. Patient in 447 was in pain all night. Kept calling for the nurse, demanding more medication. Some people don't know when it's time to let go. Gave 20 units at 0300. Vitals dropped by 0345. Called code at 0347. Time of death 0359. Family will be relieved, even if they don't know it yet. March 8th. New admit, transfer from ICU. Prognosis poor. Family seems exhausted from weeks of bedside vigils. Did them a kindness tonight. They'll mourn, but they'll also sleep. April 22nd. Difficult patient today. Rude to staff. Demanding. Complained about everything. Some people don't deserve the care they receive. Made the decision at 0200. No one will miss him. There were dozens of entries. When investigators cross-referenced the dates with hospital records, each entry corresponded to a patient death. The math was horrifying. Over 6 years, Caleb Norton had killed at least 43 people, possibly more. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder. Multiple counts. The case was airtight now. The journal provided clear intent, clear premeditation, clear admission. Caleb's lawyer knew there was no defense. The best he could do was negotiate a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. After lengthy discussions with prosecutors, a deal was reached. Caleb would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for life in prison without parole. The plea hearing was heavily attended. Families of victims filled the courtroom. Many had no idea their loved ones had been murdered until the investigation revealed the truth. Their grief was layered now, complicated by the knowledge that the deaths they had accepted as natural were actually homicides. When asked if he wanted to make a statement, Caleb stood. He looked at the families in the gallery. His expression was neutral, almost bored. "I did what I thought was right at the time," he said. "Some of those patients were suffering. Some of them were never going to get better. I made decisions that someone had to make." There were gasps from the gallery. Shouting. The judge called for order. Caleb continued, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just explaining. I controlled when and how they died. That's more than most people get. At least it was peaceful." "That's enough," the judge said sharply. But Caleb wasn't finished. "The system is broken. People are kept alive long past the point where their lives have any quality. They're in pain. Their families are in agony watching them suffer. I provided a service. Mr. Norton, sit down." Caleb sat. The judge addressed him directly. "You have committed some of the most egregious violations of trust one have encountered in my career. You were given the sacred responsibility of caring for vulnerable people. Instead of healing, you killed. Instead of comfort, you brought death. You have devastated families. You have destroyed trust in institutions. You have violated every oath you ever took." The sentence was pronounced. Life without parole, multiple consecutive life sentences. Caleb would die in prison. As he was let out of the courtroom, Caleb looked back at the families one more time. He didn't look remorseful. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied, like someone who had completed a difficult task and done it well. In the aftermath, Riverview Medical Center faced enormous scrutiny. How had this gone undetected for 6 years? Why had early warning signs been dismissed? What failures and oversight had allowed a serial killer to operate freely in a hospital? The hospital commissioned an independent review. The findings were damning. Red flags had been present for years, but were explained away. Statistical anomalies were dismissed as normal variation. Concerns raised by staff were not taken seriously enough. The review made dozens of recommendations. New monitoring systems for patient deaths. Mandatory investigation protocols when mortality rates exceed certain thresholds. Better training for staff to recognize and report suspicious patterns. anonymous reporting systems for concerns about colleagues. But the damage was done. Several families filed lawsuits. The hospital's reputation suffered. Staff members who had worked alongside Caleb struggled with guilt and horror. How had they not known? How had they worked next to a killer and never suspected? Dr. Chun, the cardiologist who first raised concerns, gave an interview to a medical journal about the case. "The lesson here," she said, "is that we must listen when something feels wrong, even when we can't immediately prove it, even when it seems unlikely. Trust in institutions is important, but blind trust is dangerous." The nursing community grappled with Caleb's crimes. He had violated everything the profession stood for. Nursing was about care, about healing, about advocacy for patients. What he had done was the darkest possible inversion of those values. Professional organizations issued statements condemning his actions. They emphasized that Caleb Norton did not represent nursing, that his crimes were an aberration, that the vast majority of nurses were dedicated, ethical professionals who would never harm a patient. But the stain remained. For years afterward, whenever someone mentioned Riverview Medical Center, people remembered the hospital where a nurse killed dozens of patients. The place where trust had been so catastrophically broken. For the families, there was no adequate response. No apology could undo what had been done. No settlement could bring back their loved ones. Many of them had said goodbye to parents or spouses or siblings, believing those deaths were natural, peaceful, inevitable. Now they knew the truth. Their loved ones had been murdered. The grief they thought they had processed had to be experienced all over again, this time with the added weight of betrayal. Some families found solace in support groups, connecting with others who understood the unique pain of losing someone to a medical professional's crimes. Others withdrew, unable to process what had happened. One daughter whose mother had died under Caleb's care spoke at a victims' rights conference. "The hardest part," she said, "is that I thanked him. After my mother died, I thanked Nurse Caleb for taking such good care of her. I told him he had made her final hours comfortable. And he smiled and said it was his pleasure. He smiled, knowing what he had done, accepting my gratitude for murdering my mother." She paused, composing herself. "I don't know how to carry that. I don't know how to live with the knowledge that I thanked my mother's killer." The psychological impact rippled outward. Patients at hospitals across the country became more suspicious, more fearful. They questioned medication. They asked more questions about who was caring for them and why. The implicit trust that makes healthcare function became strained. This was perhaps Caleb Norton's most lasting damage. Not just the 43 lives he took, but the erosion of trust his actions caused. Every patient who now worried whether their nurse could be trusted. Every family member who wondered whether a loved one's death was truly natural. Caleb himself showed no signs of remorse in prison. According to reports from correctional officers, he was a model prisoner. Quiet, compliant. He read medical journals in his cell. He sometimes wrote letters to medical ethics journals, offering his perspective on end-of-life care. The journals never published them. Psychologists who evaluated him struggled to categorize his motivations. He didn't fit the typical profile of a healthcare serial killer. He wasn't motivated by sexual gratification. He didn't seek attention. He didn't have a God complex in the traditional sense. What he had was a deep, disturbing belief that he knew better than nature, better than family members, better than the patients themselves, when life should end. He saw suffering and decided to eliminate it. He saw burdensome patients and decided to relieve the burden. He appointed himself judge and executioner, all while maintaining the gentle, caring demeanor that made people trust him. One psychologist's report concluded, "Subject demonstrates profound empathy deficits masked by learned social behaviors. He understands intellectually that others suffer, but does not experience appropriate emotional response." His actions were driven not by sadism, but by a utilitarian calculus in which he weighted lives and found some wanting. This makes him particularly dangerous, as he genuinely believes his actions were rational and even beneficial. The report recommended he never be released under any circumstances. The court agreed. Detective Torres, who had led the investigation, retired 2 years after Caleb's conviction. In his final interview with the department newsletter, he was asked what case had affected him most deeply. "Caleb Norton," he said without hesitation. "Not because of the difficulty of solving it, but because of what it revealed. Evil doesn't always look like we expect. Sometimes it looks gentle. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. Sometimes it wears scrubs and speaks softly to patients. That's the most frightening thing I learned in my career. The worst people aren't always obviously monstrous. The cardiac unit at Riverview Medical Center never fully recovered its former atmosphere. Even with new staff, new protocols, new leadership, the history remained. Nurses who worked there felt the weight of it. Patients asked about it. The deaths Caleb Norton caused had changed the space permanently. Eventually, the hospital reorganized. The cardiac unit was moved to a different floor. The old unit was converted to administrative offices. It was an acknowledgement that some places carry too much trauma to continue functioning as they were. But across the country, in hospitals and care facilities everywhere, the case became a teaching tool. Medical schools used it in ethics classes. Nursing programs discussed warning signs and reporting procedures. Risk management departments updated their monitoring systems. If there was any silver lining to the horror, it was that Caleb Norton's crimes made healthcare safer. The systems he exploited were examined and strengthened. The blind spots that allowed him to operate were illuminated and addressed. It was a desperately expensive education, paid for with 43 lives. But it was an education nonetheless. Families of victims gathered on the anniversary of Caleb's sentencing. Not every family, but enough. They met at a park near the hospital and planted trees. One for each victim. A grove of remembrance, with small plaques bearing names and dates. It wasn't justice, exactly. Justice had been served in court. This was something else. This was memory. This was refusal to let the victims be defined only by how they died. The plaques included brief descriptions chosen by families. Beloved grandmother. Devoted father. Kind friend. Not victims. People. If you liked the video, make sure you subscribe and comment where you're from. We are building a community here at Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories, and I would love to hear from you. On the other side of the country, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where kids rode bikes in cul-de-sacs and families waved to each other from porches, an 8-year-old girl woke up to something moving in her bedroom. It was late, past midnight. Hannah Reed had gone to bed hours earlier, tired from a day of playing with friends and doing homework and all the normal activities of childhood. The movement she sensed wasn't a dream. Someone was there. She opened her eyes fully and saw a figure standing near her closet. The nightlight her parents left on cast enough glow for her to see the silhouette, but not details. For a moment, her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. This was her room. This was her safe space. Nothing bad happened here. Then the figure moved toward her bed, and her body understood before her mind did. She tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth. She tried to fight, but she was small, and the person was strong, and within seconds she was being dragged from her bed toward the window. Hannah bit the hand covering her mouth. Hard. The person cursed, yanking their hand back. In that brief moment of freedom, Hannah screamed as loud as she could. The scream woke her parents. Her father bolted from their bedroom down the hall. Hannah's door was closed, which was wrong because they always left it slightly open. He threw it open and saw a man climbing out the window, Hannah struggling in his arms. Her father crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed Hannah, pulling her back. The man let go and disappeared into the darkness outside. Hannah fell to the floor, gasping and crying. Her mother appeared in the doorway, phone already dialing 911. Her father looked out the window into the backyard, but saw nothing. The man was gone. Police arrived within minutes. The house became a crime scene. Investigators examined the window, finding marks where a screen had been cut and removed. They looked for fingerprints, for footprints in the yard, for any physical evidence the intruder had left behind. They found DNA under Hannah's fingernails where she had scratched at the person trying to take her. They found a partial shoe print in the flower bed beneath her window. They found fibers on the windowsill that didn't match anything in the house. Hannah, still shaking and terrified, couldn't speak. The trauma had locked her voice somewhere deep inside. But when investigators gave her paper and crayons, she drew. A man with a baseball cap. A shirt with words on it, though she couldn't read what they said in the darkness. Shoes with a particular pattern on the sole. Her drawings were preserved carefully. Every detail mattered. The DNA was entered into the national database. No matches. The shoe print was compared against known patterns. It was a common brand, sold in thousands of stores. The fibers were synthetic, generic, impossible to trace. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Had anyone seen someone suspicious? Had there been any other break-ins or attempted break-ins? Had anyone noticed strangers in the area? Most people had seen nothing. But one neighbor, an elderly man who often sat on his porch late at night because of insomnia, remembered a car parked on the street a few nights earlier. It didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. People visiting friends, he assumed. He described the car as best he could. Dark-colored, maybe blue or black. Older model sedan. He hadn't caught the license plate. It wasn't much, but investigators added it to their file. Hannah's father quit sleeping. He installed new locks on every window. He put up security cameras. He kept a baseball bat next to the bed. But the Real security system was his vigilance. He checked on Hannah every hour through the night, making sure she was safe, making sure no one was trying to take her again. Hannah started therapy. The therapist was gentle and patient, working slowly to help Hannah process what had happened. Over weeks, Hannah's voice returned. She could talk about normal things. School, friends, her favorite TV shows. But she couldn't talk about that night. When the therapist tried to approach the subject, Hannah would shut down, retreating into silence. The investigation continued, but leads dried up. Without a match in the DNA database, without witnesses who could identify the intruder, without any clear motive or pattern connecting the attack to other crimes, detectives had nowhere to go. The case went cold, but the DNA sample was preserved. The evidence was cataloged and stored. Hannah's drawings were kept in the file. Someday, investigators hoped there would be a break. Technology would improve. Someone would be arrested for something else, and their DNA would match. Something would shake loose. Years passed. Hannah grew up. She went to middle school, then high school. She made friends and joined clubs, and lived her life. But that night was always there, a shadow that never fully lifted. She was afraid of the dark. She couldn't sleep with her window open. She had nightmares about hands reaching for her. She didn't talk about it much. Her parents knew. Her therapist knew. But to the rest of the world, Hannah was just a normal kid growing into a normal teenager growing into a normal young woman. When she was 19, she moved away for college. Her parents struggled with letting her go, worried about her safety, worried about being far away if she needed them. But Hannah insisted. She needed to prove to herself that she could be independent, that one night of terror wouldn't define her entire existence. At 23, she graduated with a degree in psychology. She wanted to help other trauma survivors. She wanted to turn her pain into something useful. At 28, she got married. At 30, she had a daughter of her own. And when her daughter turned 8, the same age Hannah had been when the attack happened, something shifted. The fear that had been manageable became overwhelming. Every night, she checked and rechecked the locks. She installed cameras. She barely slept. Her husband gently suggested she talk to someone. Hannah returned to therapy, working through the renewed intensity of her trauma. And during one session, she mentioned something she had never said before. "I wish I knew who he was," she said. "I wish I could look him in the face and ask why. Why me? What was he planning to do? Did he go on to hurt other children? Is he still out there?" Her therapist asked if she wanted to contact the police to see if there had been any developments in her case. Hannah hadn't thought about that possibility in years. The case was cold. She assumed it would stay cold forever. But she agreed to reach out. She called the police department in her hometown. The detective who had worked her case originally was long retired. But the case was still in the system. A young detective named Allison Park took her call. "I remember this case," Park said. "I reviewed it when I joined the cold case unit last year. The DNA sample is still preserved. Has there been any progress?" Hannah asked, not really expecting good news. "Actually," Park said, "there might be. We have new technology now. Genetic genealogy. It's the same technique they used to catch the Golden State Killer. We upload the DNA to public genealogy databases and look for familial matches. It's a long shot, but if you're willing, I'd like to try." Hannah agreed immediately. The process took months. The DNA sample was sent to a specialized laboratory. Analysts uploaded the genetic profile to public databases, searching for relatives of the person who had left DNA under Hannah's fingernails 30 years earlier. They got a hit. Not a direct match, but a third cousin match. From there, genealogists began building a family tree, working backward and forward through generations, identifying people who could be the contributor of the DNA sample. The tree narrowed to a specific branch of the family, then to a specific generation. then to 3 possible individuals who would have been the right age and living in the right area at the time of the attack. 2 of the 3 were already dead. The third was a man named Leon Briggs, now 57 years old, living in a small town 2 states away. Detective Park and her team began investigating Leon Briggs. He had a criminal record, minor stuff when he was younger, petty theft, vandalism, a domestic violence charge that was later dropped. Nothing that would have put his DNA in the national database, but enough to paint a picture of someone who had brushed against the law repeatedly. He was married with children. He worked in construction. To his neighbors, he seemed ordinary, maybe a little gruff, but harmless. Park needed to confirm the DNA match before making an arrest. She arranged for surveillance on Leon. When he threw away a coffee cup at a gas station, officers retrieved it. The DNA from the cup was compared to the DNA from Hannah's case. It was a match. 30 years after climbing through Hannah Reed's window and trying to abduct her, Leon Briggs was arrested. The arrest made regional news. Man arrested in decades-old attempted abduction case, thanks to genetic genealogy. Hannah's name wasn't mentioned. She was a minor at the time, and her identity was protected. But Hannah knew. Detective Park called her personally to tell her they had him. Hannah sat in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly. Not closure. Something stranger and more complicated. After 30 years of wondering, she had an answer. After 30 years of fearing a nameless shadow, the shadow had a name and a face and a life story. Leon Briggs was charged with attempted kidnapping, breaking and entering, and assault. Because of the severity of the crime and the use of genetic genealogy evidence, the case attracted significant attention from legal scholars and the media. Leon's defense attorney argued that genetic genealogy was an invasion of privacy, that using public databases in this way violated his client's rights. But prosecutors countered that Leon had violated an 8-year-old girl's rights far more severely, and that modern science simply allowed old crimes to be solved. The judge ruled the evidence admissible. Faced with undeniable DNA evidence, Leon's attorney advised him to negotiate a plea deal. Leon initially refused. He claimed he had never been in that neighborhood, never seen Hannah Reed, never committed the crime. But the DNA didn't lie. Eventually, he accepted a plea deal. 25 years in prison. Given his age, it was likely a life sentence. At the sentencing hearing, the judge asked if Hannah wanted to give a victim impact statement. She had the option to submit it in writing or to deliver it in person. She chose to be there. She stood in the courtroom and looked at Leon Briggs for the first time. He was older now, gray-haired and heavier than the shadow she remembered from childhood. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's tired uncle. "I was 8 years old," Hannah said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. "I was sleeping in my own bed, in my own house, in my own room. You cut through my window screen, and you tried to take me. I don't know what you planned to do. I don't know if I want to know. But you tried to steal my childhood. You tried to steal my safety. You tried to steal me." She paused. Leon was looking down at the table, not meeting her eyes. "I spent 30 years afraid," Hannah continued. "Afraid of the dark. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of sleeping with my window open. Every man with a baseball cap made my heart race. Every strange car on my street made me panic. You didn't just hurt me that one night. You hurt me every day after." Her voice grew stronger. "But I survived. I survived and I built a life. I got an education. I got married. I had a child of my own. And when my daughter was born, I made a promise. I promised that I would be strong for her the way I wish someone had been strong enough to catch you sooner. You didn't win. You failed that night, and you've been failing every day since while I kept living." She looked directly at him now, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I forgive you," she said. The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned to say them. But standing there, seeing this aging man who had terrorized her childhood reduced to a defendant in handcuffs, she found she didn't want to carry hatred anymore. "I forgive you because holding on to anger has cost me enough already. But forgiveness doesn't mean what you did was okay. It means I'm choosing peace over poison." She sat down. Her husband, sitting in the gallery, wiped tears from his eyes. Her parents, now elderly themselves, held each other's hands. The judge sentenced Leon Briggs to 25 years. "You have caused immeasurable harm," he said. "Not just to this victim, but to her family and to the community that lived in fear wondering if an abductor was among them. The only mercy I see in this case is that Miss Reed survived and has shown remarkable strength. As Leon was led away, he looked back at Hannah one time. Their eyes met. She couldn't read his expression. Regret? Shame? Emptiness? She would never know, and she decided that was okay. His interior life wasn't her responsibility to understand. After the sentencing, Detective Park spoke with Hannah privately. "I know this took a long time," Park said. "I'm sorry you had to wait 30 years. The important thing is you didn't give up," Hannah replied. "Someone kept that evidence. Someone kept the case file active. Someone cared enough to try new technology when it became available. That matters." The case became a landmark example of how genetic genealogy could solve cold cases. Police departments across the country began reviewing old files, identifying cases with preserved DNA that could potentially be solved using similar techniques. Dozens of cases were solved in the following years. Rapes from decades earlier, murders that had gone unsolved, abductions that had ended in tragedy. In each case, families got answers they had waited years or decades to receive. But the use of genetic genealogy also sparked debate about privacy. When people uploaded their DNA to genealogy websites to learn about their ancestry, they weren't necessarily consenting to have that information used to identify criminal relatives. The databases, created for the innocent purpose of connecting families, were now tools of law enforcement. Privacy advocates argued for stricter regulations. Law enforcement argued for broader access. The courts began working through the complex questions of what was permissible, what required warrants, what constituted reasonable search and seizure in the age of genetic information. Hannah found herself becoming an advocate for survivors of childhood trauma. She gave interviews, carefully, selectively, to media outlets that approached the story responsibly. She spoke at conferences about victim rights and cold case investigations. She wanted people to understand that justice delayed was still justice, that cases should never be forgotten just because time had passed. "There are thousands of cases like mine," she told one interviewer. "Thousands of people living with unanswered questions about who hurt them and why. Every one of those cases deserves attention. Every one of those victims deserves to know that someone is still trying to find answers." Her advocacy led to legislation in several states requiring law enforcement to preserve DNA evidence from violent crimes indefinitely. Previously, some jurisdictions destroyed evidence after a certain number of years if a case remained unsolved. The new laws ensured that future technological advances could always be applied to old cases. Hannah named the legislation Anna's Law after a young woman whose evidence had been destroyed just months before genetic genealogy might have solved her murder. Anna's family had pushed for the law's passage, ensuring no other family would face the same preventable loss. Leon Briggs became eligible for parole after serving 17 years. The parole board hearing was emotional. Hannah wrote a letter that was read at the hearing. She didn't attend in person. She had moved on, she explained, and didn't need to see him again. The letter was brief. "Leon Briggs attempted to abduct me when I was a child. The trauma of that night shaped my life in ways he probably never considered. I don't know if he has changed. I don't know if he feels genuine remorse. What I know is that he committed a serious violent crime against a child, and society benefits from keeping dangerous people separate until we can be confident they no longer pose a threat. I defer to the expertise of the board, but I ask that you consider carefully whether he has truly transformed or simply aged." The parole board denied his release. They would reconsider in 5 years. Hannah's daughter grew up knowing, in age-appropriate terms, what had happened to her mother. Hannah was careful about how she shared the story. She didn't want to terrify her daughter or make her paranoid, but she wanted her to understand that bad things could happen, that being careful was important, and that surviving difficult experiences was possible. "Something scary happened to me when I was little," Hannah told her daughter when she was 7. "But I got away and I was okay. And if anything ever scares you, you can always tell me. I'll believe you and I'll help you." Her daughter processed this information with the seriousness children often bring to important revelations. "Did they catch the bad person?" "Yes," Hannah said. "It took a long time, but yes." "Good," her daughter said, satisfied with this justice. Then she went back to playing with her dolls, the resilience of childhood allowing her to hold serious knowledge lightly. Hannah watched her daughter play and felt the weight of generational survival. She had lived through something terrible. She had carried trauma, but she had also healed enough to build a life, to raise a child, to contribute to making the world safer for others. That wasn't nothing. That was everything. In prison, Leon Briggs maintained his innocence to other inmates, despite having accepted the plea deal. He told anyone who would listen that the DNA evidence was contaminated, that he was framed, that he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the prison psychologist's report told a different story. During mandated therapy sessions, Leon had let his guard down occasionally. He had talked about urges he struggled with, attractions that he knew were wrong, fantasies that disturbed him but that he couldn't fully control. "Do you think you would have hurt the girl if you had successfully taken her?" the psychologist asked during one session. Leon was quiet for a long time. Finally, "I don't know. Maybe. Probably. What were you planning?" "I don't remember planning anything. I just saw her through the window, and I wanted. I don't know what I wanted. It wasn't sexual. It was more like possession. Like wanting to own something. And you recognize that's wrong?" "Now I do. Then, I don't think I thought about it in terms of right or wrong. I just acted." The psychologist's report concluded that Leon showed some capacity for insight, but remained a significant risk for reoffending if released. His particular pathology, desire for control and possession of vulnerable individuals, was unlikely to be resolved through age alone. The report recommended against early release. Hannah, reading a summary of this report years later through a victim notification program, felt a complicated mix of emotions. Validation that her instinct about danger had been correct. Sadness that Leon had apparently struggled with these urges for his entire adult life and never sought help before acting on them. Anger that he hadn't been caught sooner, before he could potentially harm others. Because that was the question that haunted her. Had there been others? Other children he had watched? Other windows he had climbed through? Had she been the first, or just the first time he was caught? Police had investigated that question thoroughly after his arrest. They looked for similar crimes in areas where Leon had lived. They interviewed people who knew him. They searched his home and property for any evidence of other victims. They found nothing conclusive. If there were other victims, they either didn't report it or the crimes went undetected. Leon denied hurting anyone else, and without evidence, investigators couldn't prove otherwise. This uncertainty was its own kind of burden. Hannah hoped she had been the only one, but she feared she wasn't. She channeled that fear into action. She worked with organizations that taught children body autonomy and safety. She supported legislation that required better background checks for people working with children. She donated to groups that provided therapy for trauma survivors who couldn't afford it otherwise. Every action felt small against the enormity of childhood vulnerability in the world. But small actions accumulated. Small actions became movements. Small actions saved lives. Hannah's therapist once asked her what she wanted her legacy to be. "I want people to know that surviving isn't the same as thriving, but you can move from one to the other," Hannah said. "I want kids who've been hurt to know they can still have good lives. I want parents to know they should trust their instincts about danger. I want our systems to keep trying to solve cases even when they go cold. I want my daughter to grow up in a world that's a little bit safer than the one I grew up in." "That's a good legacy," her therapist said. Hannah nodded. "It's the only one I know how to build." The anniversary of her attack used to be a dark day, something she dreaded and tried to ignore. But after Leon's conviction, she started marking it differently. She would volunteer that day at a child advocacy center, spending time with kids who were going through trauma, showing them by example that life could get better. She didn't tell them her story. She was just a nice lady who played games with them and listened when they wanted to talk and didn't push when they needed quiet. But her presence mattered. Adults who showed up, who were consistent, who were safe. Those adults changed everything for traumatized children. One of the children she worked with, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus who had witnessed domestic violence, told her during an art therapy session, "I think you understand." Hannah looked at his painting, dark colors and sharp angles representing his home life. "I do," she said simply. "Did something bad happen to you too?" "Yes. A long time ago. Are you okay now?" Hannah considered the question. Was she okay? The nightmares came less frequently now. The hypervigilance had decreased. She could sleep through the night most of the time. She had built a life filled with love and purpose. "I'm okay," she said. "Not perfect. Still working on some things. But okay." Marcus nodded, satisfied. "That's good. It means maybe I'll be okay too." "You will be," Hannah promised. And she believed it. Trauma left marks, yes. But it didn't have to write the entire story. Leon Briggs would spend the rest of his life in prison. Detective Park would retire having solved dozens of cold cases using genetic genealogy. The technology would continue to evolve, solving cases that once seemed impossible. And Hannah Reed would continue living, loving, advocating, surviving, and occasionally, in quiet moments, allowing herself to feel proud of the person she had become despite everything that had tried to break her. The case taught something essential about persistence, about keeping evidence even when cases seemed unsolvable, about trying new methods when old ones failed, about never giving up on victims just because time had passed. Justice was slow sometimes, painfully slow, 30 years slow, but slow justice was better than no justice at all. Across an ocean, in a rural landscape where farms stretched to horizons and neighbors lived miles apart, the Rowan family appeared to have everything under control. Ethan and Clara Rowan had been married for 12 years. They lived in a modest house on 40 acres near Clearwater Vale, a small community where everyone knew everyone and privacy was more about distance than discretion. They had a daughter, Sophie, who was 9 years old. Sophie attended the local school where Clara volunteered regularly, helping in the library and organizing fundraisers. Ethan worked as a farm equipment salesman, traveling throughout the region to meet with clients. They attended church most Sundays. They smiled and waved when they drove past neighbors on the long country roads. From the outside, they looked like any other family trying to make a life in a place where the economy had become increasingly difficult, where farms were consolidating and opportunities were shrinking. But behind the closed doors of their home, things were much different. Clara had tried to leave twice. The first time, she had packed a bag and driven to her sister's house 3 hours away. Ethan had followed. He had apologized, crying, promising things would change. He had been so convincing, so genuinely remorseful, that Clara had believed him. She had come back. The second time, she had gone further. She had contacted a domestic violence shelter. She had spoken with a counselor about safety planning, about how to leave without him knowing where she went. But then Sophie had gotten sick with pneumonia and needed to be hospitalized. Clara had felt she couldn't leave while her daughter was ill. And by the time Sophie recovered, the immediate crisis that had prompted Clara's decision to flee had passed. Ethan had been on his best behavior during Sophie's illness. Attentive, concerned, almost like the man she had married. Clara had convinced herself that maybe the counselor had overreacted. Maybe things weren't that bad. Maybe she was being dramatic. But she kept the shelter's number hidden in her wallet, just in case. The fights were about money, mostly. Ethan's sales commissions had been declining for years as farms in the region struggled. They were behind on mortgage payments. Credit cards were maxed out. The electricity had been shut off twice for non-payment. The stress created a constant low-level tension that occasionally exploded into shouting matches. Clara had suggested getting a job outside the home. She had a teaching degree from before Sophie was born. There were openings at schools in nearby towns. But Ethan had refused. His wife working would make him look like a failure, he said, like he couldn't provide for his family. His pride wouldn't allow it. So they continued struggling, the financial pressure building like water behind a dam. In late November, Clara mentioned divorce. Not as a threat, but as a practical consideration. Maybe we'd both be better off, she said carefully. Maybe we're just not compatible anymore. Ethan's reaction was cold. You're not taking Sophie away from me. I wouldn't take her away. We'd work out custody. No court would give you custody. I'm the one with the stable income. Ethan, we can't keep living like this. He had walked away without responding, but something in his silence frightened her more than his anger ever had. 2 weeks later, Clara and Sophie disappeared. Ethan called the police on December 7th, reporting that his wife and daughter had left the house to visit Clara's mother and hadn't returned. He seemed worried, confused. She usually calls, he told the dispatcher. Even if she's running late, she calls. Officers went to the house. Ethan explained that Clara had been struggling with depression, that she had been talking about leaving, that he was worried she might have done something rash. Do you think she would hurt herself or your daughter? An officer asked. I don't know, Ethan said, his voice breaking convincingly. I just don't know. She's been so different lately. The police contacted Clara's mother. She hadn't seen Clara or Sophie. She hadn't been expecting them. Now she was worried too. A missing person report was filed for both Clara and Sophie. Their photos were distributed. Local news ran the story. Have you seen this woman and child? Ethan gave interviews, pleading for their return. Clara, if you're watching this, please just let me know you're okay. We can work through whatever you're dealing with. Just come home. He looked like a concerned husband, a frightened father. He answered investigators' questions cooperatively. He gave them permission to search the house, the property, everything. The initial search found nothing suspicious. The house was neat. Clara's purse was gone, suggesting she had left voluntarily. Some of Sophie's clothes were missing. It appeared consistent with Ethan's story that they had left to visit family. But Clara's sister didn't believe it. She called investigators and told them about Clara's previous attempts to leave. About the fights. About Clara's fear. My sister wouldn't just disappear, she insisted. Something happened. Ethan did something. Investigators took the allegation seriously, but they needed evidence. They looked into Ethan's background more carefully. They interviewed neighbors. They examined the couple's financial records. The financial picture was worse than Ethan had suggested. They were deeply in debt. The house was in foreclosure. They were weeks away from losing everything. This gave Ethan motive. A messy divorce would mean splitting assets, even debt-ridden assets. It would mean child support payments he couldn't afford. It would mean Clara could testify about his behavior if there was any sort of custody dispute. But motive wasn't proof. The investigation widened. Police brought in cadaver dogs to search the property. The dogs alerted in several locations, but this was a farm. Animals died on farms. The alerts could have been from livestock or wildlife. Divers searched the creek that ran through the property. Nothing. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the surrounding fields. Nothing. Weeks passed. Then months. Clara and Sophie remained missing. Ethan continued maintaining his innocence, continued pleading on local news for their return. Then investigators caught a break. They were reviewing Ethan's phone records and noticed something. He had made several calls to a heavy equipment rental company in the days before reporting Clara missing. This seemed odd. Why would a farm equipment salesman need to rent equipment? They contacted the rental company. Ethan had rented an excavator. A large one. The kind used for digging deep holes or moving large amounts of earth. He had kept it for 3 days and returned it cleaned, but showing signs of heavy use. The property was already being actively investigated, but this changed the search parameters. Police focused on areas of recently disturbed earth. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. They examined satellite images from before and after Clara's disappearance, looking for changes to the landscape. On a remote corner of the property, near where the acreage bordered state forest land, they found an area that showed signs of excavation. The soil was slightly different in color and composition from surrounding areas. Vegetation was disturbed. They began digging. 6 feet down, they found Clara and Sophie. They had been wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried together, mother's arms around daughter, even in death. The medical examiner determined they had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Both of them. The injuries suggested a weapon like a hammer or heavy wrench. The deaths had been quick but violent. Ethan was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the interrogation, he maintained his innocence for hours. But when presented with the evidence, the excavator rental, the disturbed ground, the discovery of the bodies, he finally broke. "I didn't plan it," he said. I snapped. She was going to leave and take Sophie, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose them. So you killed them? I didn't mean to. It happened so fast. We were arguing, and I grabbed the hammer from the garage, and then Clara was on the ground, and Sophie was screaming, and I couldn't let her see me like that. I couldn't let her tell people. So he had killed his daughter too. To silence a witness. To hide his crime. What did you do after? Ethan described how he had wrapped their bodies and hidden them in the barn while he figured out what to do. How he had rented the excavator, digging the grave at night when no one could see. How he had buried them and then cleaned everything, getting rid of evidence, creating the story about them leaving voluntarily. "I thought I had more time," he said. "I thought by the time anyone found them, if they ever did, too much time would have passed to connect it to me." The confession was recorded. It was detailed. It was damning. The trial was relatively brief. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession eliminated any doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts. During the sentencing phase, Clara's family gave victim impact statements. Her mother spoke about losing her daughter and granddaughter. "They were everything to me," she said through tears. And he took them because his ego couldn't handle rejection, because he valued his pride more than their lives. Clara's sister spoke about the times Clara had tried to leave. The system failed her, she said. She reached out for help. She tried to protect herself and her daughter. But in the end, she was alone in that house with a man who decided she didn't have the right to choose her own life. The judge sentenced Ethan Rowan to life without parole on both counts, sentences to run consecutively. You murdered your wife because she wanted to exercise her fundamental right to leave an unhappy marriage, the judge said. Then you murdered your own child to cover up your crime. These actions demonstrate a level of selfishness and depravity that demands the harshest punishment available under law. As Ethan was led from the courtroom, he looked back at Clara's family one time. Clara's mother met his eyes and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I hope you think about what you did every single day for the rest of your miserable life." In the aftermath, the community of Clearwater Vale struggled to reconcile what had happened. The Rowans had seemed normal. They had been neighbors, acquaintances, familiar faces at the store and the post office. How had no one seen the warning signs? But domestic violence worked like that. It happened behind closed doors. It was hidden by carefully constructed facades. Abusers learned to control their image in public while exercising violence in private. The case prompted local organizations to increase their outreach about domestic violence resources. Churches started hosting information sessions about recognizing warning signs. The school where Clara had volunteered created a memorial scholarship in her and Sophie's names, awarded annually to a student pursuing education or social work. These efforts couldn't bring Clara and Sophie back, but they might save the next person who was trapped in a dangerous relationship and didn't know how to get out. Clara's sister became an advocate for domestic violence victims. She spoke at conferences and community events about her sister's story, not to sensationalize it, but to illustrate how common and how deadly intimate partner violence was. "My sister tried to leave twice," she would tell audiences. "She did what everyone says victims should do. She reached out for help. She made plans. But in the end, her abuser's determination to control her was stronger than the systems designed to protect her." We need better support for people trying to leave. We need faster responses from law enforcement. We need communities that look out for each other instead of assuming everything is fine behind closed doors. She pushed for legislative changes, stronger protective orders, better training for police responding to domestic violence calls, more funding for shelters, laws that allowed for emergency custody transfers when one parent posed a credible threat. Some of these initiatives passed. Others stalled in committees or were voted down due to funding concerns. But the conversation continued. Clara's name became associated with the push for better protections. Ethan's family struggled with their own grief and shame. His parents issued a statement after the trial. "We are horrified by what our son did. We grieve for Clara and Sophie. We failed to see the warning signs. We failed to intervene. We will carry this guilt for the rest of our lives." To Clara's family, we offer our deepest apologies, though we know words can never be adequate. Some of Clara's family accepted this apology. Others couldn't. The pain was too fresh, too raw. Ethan's parents had lost a son to his own actions. Clara's parents had lost a daughter and granddaughter to violence. Both families were destroyed, just in different ways. The house where the murders occurred sat empty for years. No one wanted to buy it, despite the property's value. Eventually, a developer purchased it at a steep discount, demolished the house, and subdivided the land. The new owners who built there didn't know the history. Or if they did, they made peace with it in whatever way people make peace with places where terrible things happened. The grave where Clara and Sophie had been buried became a crime scene, then was filled in and returned to nature. But Clara's family had their bodies moved to a cemetery near where Clara's mother lived. A double headstone marked their resting place. Mother and daughter, together in death as they had been in life. Sophie's classmates planted a tree at the school in her memory. Every year on her birthday, her teacher from that final year would bring her class outside to sit under the tree. They would talk about Sophie, keeping her memory alive, about her love of reading, about how she always shared her snacks, about her laugh. As the children grew older and moved on to other schools, the tradition faded. New students didn't know Sophie. The tree remained, growing taller each year, but the story behind it was gradually forgotten by everyone except those who had known her. Clara's mother visited the grave every week. She would sit on the bench nearby and talk to her daughter and granddaughter, telling them about family news, about flowers blooming in her garden, about nothing and everything. The one-sided conversations were her way of maintaining connection, of refusing to let death be the final word. "I miss you both so much," she would say. "The world is quieter without you in it." And it was. 2 voices silenced. 2 lives ended. All because one man valued control more than he valued the people he claimed to love. The case taught ugly truths about domestic violence. That it could happen anywhere, to anyone. That abusers were often charming in public. That financial stress could escalate danger. That leaving was often the most dangerous time. That children were sometimes killed not out of rage at them specifically, but as collateral damage or witnesses to be eliminated. These truths were uncomfortable. They challenged the notion that if someone was really being abused, they would just leave. They highlighted the reality that leaving often required resources, planning, and support that not everyone had access to. Clara had tried. She had wanted to leave. But the systems designed to help her hadn't been strong enough, fast enough, or coordinated enough to protect her when the threat escalated from verbal abuse and control to lethal violence. Ethan Rowan in prison became a case study. Psychologists interviewed him, trying to understand the mindset that led a father to kill his own child. His answers were chilling in their banality. "I loved Sophie," he would say, "but in that moment, she became a problem to be solved." I know how that sounds. I know it's monstrous. But that's the truth. She was a witness. She would have told people. I couldn't let that happen. The complete absence of protective instinct toward his daughter, the total override of parental love by self-preservation, disturbed even experienced forensic psychologists. Most people who killed in rage showed some remorse. Ethan showed analysis. He was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. His sense of self was so fragile that any threat to his image or control became an existential crisis that justified any response, including murder. If he couldn't have them on his terms, he would make sure no one could have them, one psychologist wrote in her assessment. To him, his wife and child were possessions, not people. When those possessions tried to leave, he destroyed them rather than accept loss. This psychological profile became teaching material in criminal justice courses. It helped law enforcement and social workers identify risk factors: possessiveness, extreme control, inability to accept responsibility, escalating anger when control was challenged. These red flags, when present together, indicated serious danger. Domestic violence advocates used Ethan's case to push back against the question they heard so often: why didn't she just leave? Clara had tried to leave. Leaving had gotten her killed. The question shouldn't be why didn't she leave, but why didn't the community do more to support her leaving safely? Shelters in the region expanded their capacity. New protocols were developed for emergency protective custody of children when a parent was deemed dangerous. Judges received training on the lethality indicators in domestic violence cases. Would these changes have saved Clara and Sophie? Maybe. Maybe not. But they might save the next person. They might save someone else's daughter. Someone else's grandchild. That was the only meaning that could be extracted from such senseless deaths. Not justice, because justice couldn't restore life. But change. Improvement. Learning. Evolution of systems that had failed. Clara's sister carried a photo of Clara and Sophie in her wallet. Sometimes, giving presentations about domestic violence, she would show the photo to the audience. "This is who we failed," she would say. Not a statistic. Not a case number. A woman who loved books and gardening and her daughter. A little girl who wanted to be a veterinarian. Real people with real futures that were stolen. The human face on the statistics mattered. It prevented people from becoming numb to numbers. 2 women killed by intimate partners every week in the country. That number was almost too large to process. But Clara and Sophie, their specific faces, their specific story, that penetrated in ways statistics couldn't. Years after the murders, Clearwater Vale remained a quiet rural community. Farms continued operating, though there were fewer of them every year. People still knew their neighbors, still waved when they passed on country roads. But everyone who lived through the Rowan case carried it differently now. They paid more attention when someone seemed isolated. They asked more questions when a neighbor hadn't been seen in a while. They created networks of checking in, of being present, of not assuming that closed doors meant everything was fine. The community had been wounded by what happened. But like any wound, it tried to heal. Not by forgetting, but by growing protective scar tissue. By becoming more vigilant. by refusing to let such a failure happen again if awareness and intervention could prevent it. The memorial scholarship in Clara and Sophie's names funded 15 students over the years. Social workers, teachers, counselors, young people who wanted to help others, who wanted to prevent suffering, who wanted to build a world where violence wasn't the answer to conflict. Each recipient received a letter with their scholarship notification. The letter explained who Clara and Sophie were, what had happened to them, why the scholarship existed. "We hope you will carry their memory into your work," the letter concluded. "We hope you will be the person someone in danger can turn to. We hope you will be part of a generation that refuses to accept violence as inevitable." Most recipients kept the letter. They would look at it during difficult moments in their education or careers, when the work seemed overwhelming, when they questioned whether they could really make a difference. Clara and Sophie's deaths had rippled outward in ways that Ethan, buried in his narcissism and self-pity, could never comprehend. He had tried to eliminate them, to erase them, to make it as if they had never existed. But he had failed. They lived on in memory, in scholarships, in changed laws, in trained responders, in people who now knew what warning signs to watch for. Their deaths had meaning precisely because people refused to let them be forgotten. This was the only justice available to the murdered, not the court verdict, though that mattered, but the refusal of those left behind to let death be the final chapter. The insistence that lives stolen too soon would still make the world different, would still matter, would still teach and protect and inspire. Ethan Rowan would die in prison, eventually. His name would be forgotten by everyone except those whose job was to keep him incarcerated. He would become nothing, but Clara and Sophie would remain, in hearts and minds and actions, in the lives saved by people who learned from their deaths, in the gradual, incomplete, but real progress toward a world where domestic violence was treated as the serious crime it was. That was their legacy. That was their continuation. And somewhere in a cemetery, under a tree that provided shade in summer, two graves rested side by side. The headstone read simply, Clara and Sophie Rowan, beloved daughter and granddaughter, gone too soon, never forgotten. Visitors to the cemetery would sometimes pause at the grave. Some knew the story. Others just noticed the dates, the mother and daughter who died on the same day, and understood that something tragic had happened. They would stand there for a moment in respect, for grief, for the reminder that life was fragile and precious, for the recognition that behind every headstone was a story, a loss, a ripple of consequences that extended far beyond the stone and grass. And then they would move on, carrying with them the brief encounter with mortality and injustice, letting it inform how they lived their own lives, how they treated their own families, how they showed up for their communities. This was how the dead continued to speak, through the living who listened, through the lessons that survivors insisted be learned, through the changes that tragedy demanded and that good people implemented. Clara and Sophie were gone, but their impact remained, spreading outward in ways that would touch people who never knew their names but benefited from the systems improved in their memory. That wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all that grief and rage and sorrow could be transformed into. On a different continent, in a city where wealth created its own geography and rules, another kind of violence was unfolding behind gates and high walls. The address was prestigious. The family was known. Their name appeared on charity donor lists and business news articles. They employed drivers, housekeepers, security personnel. They moved through the world with the confidence that comes from never having to question whether resources would be available when needed. Nadia Karim worked as a marketing consultant. She was 34 years old, educated, successful by most measures. She came from a middle-class family, had put herself through university, had built a career through competence and hard work. When she met Ryan Koresh at a business conference, she was charmed by his attention. He was handsome, articulate, from a family whose wealth went back generations. He pursued her with intensity, sending flowers, arranging elaborate dates, talking about future plans within weeks of meeting. It felt like a fairy tale. The successful woman and the wealthy heir. Her family was thrilled. Her friends were envious. They were engaged within 6 months, married within a year. The first time Ryan hit her was 3 months after the wedding. They had been arguing about her work schedule. She had a presentation to prepare and couldn't attend a family dinner. His response was a slap across her face. He apologized immediately. He was stressed, he said. His father was putting pressure on him about the family business. He had never done anything like that before and would never do it again. Nadia believed him. She wanted to believe him. But it happened again and again. The apologies continued but became less convincing. The violence escalated from slaps to punches, from shouting to choking, from occasional outbursts to regular occurrences. Nadia tried to leave. She went to her parents' house. But Ryan's family had influence. They contacted her parents, explaining that Nadia was being dramatic, that all couples fought, that she needed to learn how to be a proper wife. Her parents, impressed by the family's wealth and status, pressured her to go back. "You're married now," her mother said. "You worked through difficulties. You don't just run away." So Nadia returned, and the violence continued. She tried to confide in friends. But Ryan was careful. He never left marks that were visible when she was dressed. He never hit her in front of others. In public, he was affectionate and attentive. Her friends saw a loving husband. When she tried to tell them otherwise, they seemed skeptical. "Ryan? He adores you. I've never seen him be anything but kind." Nadia stopped trying to tell people. The gap between her private reality and her public life became a chasm she couldn't bridge. The household staff knew. They heard the shouting. They saw Nadia's bruises when she was at home in casual clothes. They cleaned up broken objects after fights. But they said nothing. They needed their jobs. Ryan's family employed dozens of people. Speaking out meant unemployment, potentially being blacklisted from other positions. The economy was difficult. Jobs with families like the Koreshes were coveted. So they kept silent. They averted their eyes. They did their jobs and tried not to think about what they were witnessing. Ryan's security team knew. They were employed directly by his family to protect family members and property. They saw the arguments. They sometimes had to intervene when things got particularly violent, not to stop Ryan, but to ensure he didn't do permanent damage that might create scandal. One security guard, a man named Tarek who had worked for the family for 8 years, struggled with what he witnessed. He pulled Nadia aside one day when Ryan was at the office. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if you need help leaving, I can assist. I can make sure you get somewhere safe." Nadia looked at him with eyes that had lost their light. "Where would I go? His family knows everyone. They have resources I can't compete with. I tried leaving once. They brought me back. There are organizations. Shelters. Do you think a shelter could keep me safe from them?" Nadia laughed bitterly. "Thank you for your concern. But there's no way out." Tarek wanted to push harder, to insist, to force the issue. But he didn't. He backed off. He went back to his post. Later, he would hate himself for that. The violence escalated over months. Ryan's business ventures were failing. Money was being lost. His father was threatening to cut him off from the family fortune if he didn't turn things around. The pressure he felt manifested as rage that he directed at Nadia. She became his outlet. When deals fell through, he hit her. When his father criticized him, he hit her. When he felt inadequate or anxious or frustrated, he hit her. Nadia stopped going to her office. She told her clients she was taking personal time. She stayed in the house, trying to be invisible, trying not to provoke Ryan's temper. But everything provoked it. Dinner prepared incorrectly. A phone call from her mother. The television being on a channel he didn't like. The weather being too hot. The traffic being too heavy. Anything could spark his violence. In October, Nadia tried to leave again. She packed a small bag and walked out while Ryan was sleeping. She made it 3 blocks before his security team found her. They brought her back, not forcefully but firmly. One of them called Ryan to report that they had retrieved her. Ryan's response was the worst beating yet. He used his fists, his feet, objects he grabbed from around the room. He wanted to punish her for the humiliation of trying to leave, for making him look weak, for suggesting she didn't need him. When he finally stopped, Nadia was barely conscious. Blood was everywhere. Several ribs were broken. Her face was swollen beyond recognition. Ryan panicked. If she died, there would be questions. There would be investigations. His family's reputation would be damaged. He called his father. His father arrived with the family doctor, a man who had been on the Koresh payroll for years. The doctor examined Nadia and recommended immediate hospitalization. But Ryan's father refused. "Take care of her here," he ordered. "No hospitals. No police. No scandal." The doctor protested weakly, but complied. He treated Nadia's injuries as best he could in the bedroom. He set her broken bones. He stitched her wounds. He gave her pain medication. But she needed more care than he could provide in a private home. Her injuries were severe. One of her broken ribs had punctured a lung. Internal bleeding was likely. The doctor told Ryan's father this. Again, the decision was made to keep her at home. The family's reputation was more important than proper medical care. Nadia lingered for 3 days. The doctor visited daily, providing what care he could. The household staff whispered among themselves, but did nothing. The security team maintained their posts. Ryan alternated between contrition and anger. On the 3rd day, Nadia's condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctor recommended calling an ambulance. This time, Ryan's father agreed. The situation had progressed beyond what could be hidden. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics were told Nadia had fallen downstairs. The story didn't match her injuries, but with Ryan's family standing there, watching, the paramedics didn't press the issue. Nadia died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Massive internal bleeding. Multiple organ failure. Trauma inconsistent with a fall. The hospital called the police. The investigation began immediately. The emergency room doctor who examined Nadia's body took extensive photographs. The injuries told a clear story. This was not an accident. This was sustained, brutal violence. Homicide detectives went to the creche residence. They interviewed Ryan, who stuck to his story. Nadia had fallen. It was a terrible accident. He was devastated. They interviewed household staff. One by one, servants and security guards were questioned. Most repeated Ryan's story. They had heard a fall. They had found her at the bottom of the stairs. But one young housekeeper, a woman named Amara who had only been working for the family for 3 months, broke under questioning. She told the truth. She described the beatings she had witnessed. The screaming. The blood. The way Ryan would lose control and then act as if nothing had happened. Her testimony gave detectives the opening they needed. They obtained search warrants for the house. They found blood in the bedroom that had been incompletely cleaned. They found broken furniture that had been hastily discarded. They found Nadia's journal, hidden in the back of a drawer, describing months of abuse. The journal was damning. Entry after entry documenting violence. Describing injuries. Recording dates and times. Nadia had been keeping evidence, perhaps hoping it would matter someday. Perhaps just needing to write it down to convince herself it was real. He says he loves me, but I don't think he knows what love is. One entry read. Love doesn't leave bruises. Love doesn't make you afraid to speak. Love doesn't trap you. Another entry. I tried to tell my mother. She said I was being ungrateful. That I had married into a good family and needed to appreciate what I had. How do I explain that what I have is a prison? The journal went on for pages. A record of suffering. A testimony written by a victim who knew she might not survive to testify in person. Armed with the journal, with Amara's testimony, with the forensic evidence from the house and from Nadia's body, prosecutors charged Ryan Koresh with murder. His family hired the best defense attorneys money could buy. They worked to discredit Amara's testimony. They suggested the journal might have been fabricated. They proposed alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. But the case was too strong. Too much physical evidence. Too much documentation. Too many small details that corroborated each other. When it became clear that acquittal was unlikely, Ryan's attorneys negotiated a plea deal. He would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The sentence would be 20 years rather than life. Prosecutors reluctantly agreed. A trial was expensive and uncertain. A plea guaranteed conviction and significant prison time. But charges didn't stop with Ryan. The family doctor was charged with medical malpractice and being an accessory after the fact. He had failed to report suspected abuse. He had failed to ensure proper medical care. His license was revoked. He received a suspended sentence in exchange for his testimony. Ryan's father was charged with obstruction of justice. He had actively prevented Nadia from receiving proper medical care. He had instructed staff to lie to investigators. He was convicted and received 5 years probation. 3 members of the security team were charged with false imprisonment for the incident when they brought Nadia back after she tried to leave. They pled guilty to reduced charges and received suspended sentences. The household staff who had witnessed abuse but said nothing were not charged criminally, but several faced civil lawsuits from Nadia's family. The trial brought attention to how wealth could enable and hide domestic violence. Ryan's family had used their resources, their influence, their network of employees to protect him and control Nadia. Every system that should have protected her, family, friends, even law enforcement to some degree, had been compromised by the family's power and status. Nadia's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Koresh family. The civil trial became another opportunity to expose the systematic failure to protect Nadia. Testimony revealed that multiple people had known about the abuse for months, that opportunities to intervene had been deliberately avoided, that protecting the family's reputation had been prioritized over protecting Nadia's life. The jury awarded Nadia's family a substantial settlement. The money wouldn't bring their daughter back, but it represented acknowledgement. The system, through the civil courts if not the criminal ones, was saying that Nadia's life had mattered, that her suffering deserved recognition, that the people who enabled her death should face consequences. Amara, the housekeeper who had testified truthfully, lost her job immediately after giving her statement to police. She struggled to find new employment. Other wealthy families didn't want to hire someone who had spoken against her employers, even if those employers were criminals. But domestic violence organizations took notice of her story. She was offered a position at a women's shelter, working with other survivors. Her experience and her courage made her an effective advocate. She understood what it felt like to witness abuse and feel powerless to stop it. She understood the economics of silence. "I wish I had spoken up sooner," she told a group of new shelter volunteers during training. "I knew what was happening to her. I heard her crying. I saw her injuries. But I was afraid of losing my job. And while I was protecting my job, she was dying." She paused, composing herself. "Don't be like me. Don't wait. If you see something, say something. Your silence might cost someone their life." The shelter named their legal advocacy program after Nadia. The Nadia Karim Legal Defense Fund provided free legal representation to women trying to leave abusive relationships, particularly when their abusers had significant financial resources. The fund's mission statement was direct. Wealth should not be a shield for violence. Every survivor deserves access to legal protection regardless of their abuser's resources or influence. In the first year, the fund helped 43 women obtain protective orders against wealthy or well-connected abusers. 3 of those cases involved families who had previously used their influence to intimidate victims into silence. The fund's attorneys didn't back down from powerful defendants. They pursued justice aggressively. Ryan served 12 years of his 20-year sentence before being granted parole. His family had continued to employ lawyers who worked every angle to reduce his time. They argued he had been rehabilitated, that he had completed anger management programs, that he was remorseful. Nadia's family fought the parole vigorously. They submitted statements detailing the ongoing impact of Nadia's murder. They argued that 12 years was insufficient punishment for torture and murder. But the parole board ultimately decided to release him, citing his completion of programs and his family's commitment to monitoring him. When Nadia's mother learned of the parole decision, she gave an interview to a national news outlet. 12 years, she said. He tortured my daughter for months. He killed her. And after 12 years, he gets to go home to his family's mansion. He gets to have a life. Nadia doesn't get a life. She got a grave. The interview went viral. Public outcry was intense. Activists protested outside the parole board offices. Petitions circulated demanding reforms to the parole system. The outcry didn't change Ryan's release, but it did prompt legislative review of parole decisions in domestic violence cases. New guidelines were established requiring parole boards to give greater weight to victim impact statements. Parole hearings for domestic violence offenders would now include mandatory review by domestic violence experts. These changes came too late for Nadia, but they might protect future victims. They might keep other abusers incarcerated longer. Ryan returned to his family's home. He was required to wear an ankle monitor for 5 years. He was prohibited from contacting any of Nadia's family members. He was required to continue counseling, but he was free. He could eat meals with his family. He could sleep in his own bed. He could watch television and go for walks in the garden and live his life. Nadia remained in a cemetery plot, her headstone reading, Nadia Karim. Beloved daughter, your voice was silenced, but your story continues. Her grave was visited regularly, not just by family, but by strangers. Women who had survived domestic violence would come to pay respects. They would leave flowers or small stones or handwritten notes. Thank you for not being forgotten, one note read. Your story gave me courage to leave. Another, I saw your story on the news. It made me realize I didn't have to accept being hurt. I'm safe now because of you. The notes accumulated. Some were taken away by family members who kept them. Others were left to weather and fade, their messages dissolving back into the earth like prayers. Tarek, the security guard who had offered to help Nadia escape, quit his job with the Koresh family the day after Nadia died. He couldn't work for them anymore. The money wasn't worth the complicity. He struggled financially for a while. He had been well paid in his security position and had built his life around that income. Leaving meant downsizing, struggling, reconsidering everything. But he found work eventually with an organization that provided security for women's shelters. The pay was less. The work was sometimes dangerous when angry ex-partners showed up. But it felt like penance. Like trying to balance the scales for the time he had failed to push harder to help Nadia. "I can't undo what I didn't do," he told his new supervisor during his interview. "But I can make sure I don't make that mistake again." Years later, he would be working at a shelter when a woman arrived in the middle of the night, fleeing her husband. She was terrified. The husband had money, connections, power. She was convinced he would find her and drag her back. Tarek sat with her while the shelter staff made arrangements for her safety. "I knew someone like you once," he said quietly. "She didn't make it out. But you're going to. I promise you, we're not going to let him get to you." The woman's name was not Nadia. Her circumstances were different in details. But the core was the same. Violence, control, power imbalance. The belief that wealth could make someone untouchable. Tarek stayed with her through that first terrifying night. When her husband's private investigators showed up at the shelter, Tarek stood at the door and turned them away. When the husband himself arrived, shouting demands, Tarek called the police and made sure a protective order was enforced. The woman stayed at the shelter for 3 months. During that time, the Legal Advocacy Fund helped her file for divorce, obtain a protective order, and secure custody of her children. The husband tried to use his money to overwhelm her with legal costs, but the fund's attorneys matched him motion for motion. Eventually, worn down by the realization that his money couldn't simply overpower the support system protecting his wife, the husband settled. The divorce was granted. Custody was awarded to the mother with supervised visitation only. The woman rebuilt her life. She moved to a different city, started over, found work, raised her children away from violence. And Tarek moved on to the next person who needed help. And the next, making up for Nadia in small acts of intervention and protection that accumulated over years. He couldn't save everyone. No one could. But he saved some. And sometimes, some was enough. The Koresh family's reputation never recovered. Their business associates distanced themselves. Charities quietly removed their name from donor recognition. Invitations to social events stopped coming. Wealth could buy many things, but it couldn't buy back respectability once the truth of their complicity in Nadia's death became public knowledge. Ryan's father died 3 years after Ryan's release from prison. The funeral was small, attended only by immediate family and a handful of longtime business associates who felt obligated. The obituary in the newspaper was brief and made no mention of his son or the scandal. When asked if he would comment on his father's death, Ryan declined. He had largely withdrawn from public life, living quietly in the family estate, rarely leaving the grounds. The ankle monitor had been removed after 5 years, but he remained confined by his own notoriety. People recognized him. They whispered. They pointed. He became a pariah. This social death was not the same as justice. Nadia was still gone. Ryan was still alive. The imbalance remained. But it was something. The acknowledgement that money couldn't fully insulate someone from consequences. That public opinion, even if it couldn't put someone in prison, could still impose costs. Nadia's mother continued her advocacy work for nearly a decade after her daughter's death. She spoke at conferences. She lobbied lawmakers. She worked with shelters and legal organizations. Then, at 67 years old, she was diagnosed with cancer. She fought it for 2 years. During that time, she put her affairs in order. She established a trust that would continue funding the Legal Defense Fund after her death. She wrote letters to her grandchildren explaining who their Aunt Nadia had been, what she had valued, why her story mattered. When she died, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, survivors whom she had helped, advocates whom she had inspired, lawyers whom she had worked with. They came to honor not just her, but through her, Nadia. The eulogy mentioned both women. She lost her daughter to violence, the speaker said, but she refused to let that violence have the final word. She turned grief into action. She turned loss into protection for others. She embodied the principle that the best way to honor the dead is to defend the living. Nadia's father, now elderly and frail, survived his wife by only 18 months. He had never fully recovered from losing his daughter. The guilt of having pressured her to stay in the marriage haunted him. His wife's death removed the last anchor keeping him present. When he died, he was buried beside his wife and daughter. 3 graves in a row. 3 lives connected by love and by the violence that had shattered their family. But the work continued. The legal defense fund continued. The shelter named after Nadia continued. The legislation passed in response to her death continued to protect other victims. Ryan Koresh would eventually die too, though at the time of this writing he remains alive, living in isolation in the family estate. When his death comes, it will likely be noted only briefly in the news. A name from an old scandal. A person who had committed terrible crimes and served inadequate time. His obituary, when it is written, will likely gloss over the circumstances that made him notorious. Families often do that, trying to protect the deceased's memory even when protection isn't deserved. But historians and researchers studying domestic violence will remember him differently. He will be a case study, an example of how wealth enables abuse, a data point in the ongoing effort to understand and prevent intimate partner violence. And Nadia will be remembered too, not just as a victim, but as someone whose death demanded change, whose story educated, whose suffering, as unjust and preventable as it was, motivated people to create better systems. This was cold comfort. The world was better because she died, but it would have been better still if she had lived. That paradox sat at the heart of every case where tragedy led to reform. Progress built on bodies. Justice achieved too late to save the person it was meant to protect. But the alternative, forgetting, learning nothing, allowing the same failures to repeat, was worse. So people remembered. They fought. They advocated. They tried to build a world where the next Nadia had a better chance of survival. The work was never finished. There would always be another person trapped in a violent relationship. Another abuser using power to hide crimes. Another system failing to protect someone vulnerable. But there would also always be people fighting back. Advocates and lawyers and shelter workers and reformed security guards and housekeepers who chose truth over employment. People who said no to complicity. Who believed that every life mattered more than reputation or money or convenience. This was the ongoing battle. Not always won. Often lost. But always worth fighting. Nadia Karim had lost her battle. But the war she unwittingly became part of continued. In courtrooms and shelters and legislative chambers. In quiet conversations where someone admitted they needed help. In brave moments when witnesses chose truth. The war continued. And in that continuation was meaning. In that persistence was honor. In that refusal to accept violence as inevitable was hope. In a quiet suburb of a mid-sized American city, in a house with a neat lawn and children's toys in the yard, another kind of violence was unfolding. This one was harder to see, harder to name. It wore the disguise of maternal care. Marisol Vega was 39 years old, a stay-at-home mother to 3 children. Her husband, David, worked long hours as an engineer. They had married young, had their children quickly, and from the outside appeared to be living an ordinary middle-class life. Marisol was involved in her children's schools. She volunteered at the PTA. She organized birthday parties and playdates. She was the kind of mother other mothers envied, seemingly devoted and endlessly patient. But behind closed doors, something was terribly wrong. It started with the youngest child, Emma, who was 4 years old. Emma began experiencing mysterious illnesses. Stomach pains, vomiting, fever. Marisol would rush her to the emergency room, describing symptoms with perfect maternal concern. The doctors would run tests. Sometimes they found minor infections that could explain the symptoms. Other times they found nothing conclusive. Emma would be treated and sent home, usually with Marisol praised for being such an attentive mother who brought her daughter in quickly. Then it would happen again and again. Emma spent more time in hospitals than most children her age. She missed preschool frequently. She was small for her age, not growing as expected. David worried but trusted his wife. Marisol was the primary caregiver. She was there for every doctor's appointment, every emergency room visit, every scary midnight moment when Emma's fever spiked. If anyone knew what Emma needed, it was Marisol. Then the middle child, Jacob, 7 years old, started having similar problems. Stomach issues, unexplained fevers. Weakness. He had always been healthy before, but suddenly he was sick constantly. 2 sick children. The doctors started considering genetic conditions. Maybe there was some inherited disorder affecting both of them. Tests were run. Specialists were consulted. No clear diagnosis emerged. The oldest child, Sophia, who was 10, remained healthy. This seemed to support the theory of a genetic condition that she somehow didn't carry. But Sophia noticed something. She noticed that her siblings got sick after eating or drinking things their mother prepared specially for them. She noticed that she was often sent to her room or to a friend's house when Emma and Jacob were having their worst episodes. She was young, and she loved her mother, so she didn't quite understand what she was seeing. But she felt uneasy. One day, when Emma was having another bad spell and Marisol was preparing to take her to the hospital, Sophia saw her mother in the kitchen. Marisol didn't know Sophia was watching. She was adding something to Emma's juice cup, something from a small bottle she then tucked into her purse. Sophia asked what it was. Marisol startled, then smiled. Just medicine to help Emma feel better. But the medicine was making Emma feel worse, not better. Sophia was young, but she wasn't stupid. Something was wrong. She mentioned it to her father that night. David dismissed it. Your mother is taking care of Emma. Don't worry about things you don't understand. So Sophia stopped talking about it. But she started paying more attention. Over the following weeks, she noticed the pattern. Emma and Jacob would be fine. Then their mother would give them something special. A drink. A snack. Something just for them. And within hours, they would be sick again. Sophia started refusing food that was only for her, claiming she wasn't hungry. Marisol would seem frustrated by this, but she didn't push hard. Sophia remained healthy. Meanwhile, Emma's condition worsened. She was hospitalized for 3 days due to severe dehydration and organ stress. The doctors were baffled. Normally healthy children shouldn't be experiencing this level of distress without a clear cause. A particularly astute resident noticed something. Emma's symptoms improved dramatically when she was in the hospital. When she went home, within days she was sick again. The resident mentioned this pattern to the attending physician. Could it be something environmental in the home? The attending wondered. Mold. Toxin exposure. A social worker was brought in to assess the home environment. She visited and found nothing alarming. The house was clean. The parents seemed loving and concerned. There were no obvious hazards. But the social worker, whose name was Patricia, had worked in child welfare for 15 years. She had developed instincts about situations that looked normal but felt wrong. Something about Marisol's perfect performance of concerned motherhood bothered her. She requested that Emma remain in the hospital for extended observation. Marisol seemed upset by this. She should be home with her family, Marisol insisted. But the doctors agreed with Patricia's suggestion. Emma stayed in the hospital. For 2 weeks, Emma's health improved. No more vomiting. No more fevers. She gained weight. She had energy. She played and laughed and seemed like a normal 4-year-old. The medical team was puzzled but relieved. Whatever had been causing Emma's illness seemed to have resolved. She was discharged home. Within 3 days, she was back in the emergency room. This pattern finally triggered the alert. Patricia, who had been monitoring the case, recommended that Child Protective Services get involved. Something was making these children sick, and it seemed to be connected to being home. CPS opened an investigation. A caseworker visited the home. She interviewed Marisol, David, and the children separately. Sophia, when asked if she felt safe at home, hesitated. It was the first time any adult had asked her that question directly. "I'm safe," she said. "But Emma and Jacob keep getting sick. Do you have any idea why?" Sophia looked down. She was 10 years old. She didn't want to betray her mother, but she also didn't want her siblings to keep suffering. "Mom gives them special drinks," she said quietly, "and then they get sick." The caseworker asked more questions. "What kind of special drinks? How often? Did Sophia ever drink them?" Sophia answered as best she could. She didn't know what was in the drinks, but she knew the pattern, and she knew she had stopped accepting anything her mother offered that was just for her. The caseworker shared this information with the medical team and with law enforcement. The police began an investigation. They obtained a search warrant for the Vega home. In Marisol's bathroom, hidden in a box of tampons where David would never look, they found bottles of ipecac syrup and high-dose laxatives. Both substances, when given in excessive amounts, could cause the exact symptoms Emma and Jacob had been experiencing. They also found Marisol's journal. The entries were disturbing. "Emma's appointment went well today. The doctors are very concerned. They're talking about running more tests. It feels good to be taken seriously. They see me as such a devoted mother. Jacob's teacher commented on how much school he's been missing. I explained about his health problems. She was very sympathetic. It's nice to be appreciated for how hard this is. The support group for parents of sick children has been wonderful. Everyone understands what I'm going through. They see how strong I have to be. The journal made clear what was happening. Marisol was making her children sick deliberately, not out of hatred or malice toward them, but to receive attention, sympathy, support. The sick children made her feel important, needed, admired. It was a psychological condition called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The perpetrator, usually a parent or caregiver, deliberately causes illness in someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy from medical professionals and others. Marisol was arrested and charged with 2 counts of child abuse. Emma and Jacob were placed in protective custody with David, who was devastated by the revelation. I didn't know, he told investigators over and over. I trusted her. I thought she was protecting them. A forensic psychologist evaluated Marisol. The assessment revealed a woman with deep-seated needs for attention and validation. As a child, she had been ignored by her parents who were focused on her chronically ill sibling. She had learned that illness brought attention. Health brought invisibility. As an adult, she had recreated that dynamic with her own children. She loved them, in her way, but she loved the attention their illness brought her more. Do you understand that what you did hurt your children? The psychologist asked during one session. I never meant to hurt them, Marisol said. I needed people to see how hard I was trying, how good of a mother I was. When they were sick, everyone appreciated me. But you made them sick. Marisol didn't answer that directly. I always took them to the doctor. I always made sure they got care. You also made sure they needed care. Silence. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. The journal entries were particularly damning, showing clear premeditation and awareness of what she was doing. Marisol's attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity due to mental illness, but the prosecution successfully argued that Marisol had known her actions were wrong, as evidenced by her efforts to hide the medications and her selective victimization of only some of her children. She was convicted on both counts of child abuse. The sentencing phase considered whether she should be charged with attempted murder, given that her actions could have killed Emma or Jacob. Ultimately, the charges remained as aggravated child abuse. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. At the sentencing, the judge addressed her directly. You took your children's health, their childhoods, their trust, and you sacrificed all of it for attention. You were their mother. You were supposed to protect them. Instead, you became the threat they needed protection from. David divorced Marisol while she was awaiting trial. He got full custody of all 3 children. He moved them to a different city, hoping for a fresh start away from the community that knew their story. Emma and Jacob underwent extensive medical evaluation to determine what long-term damage had been done. Both had developed chronic digestive issues from the repeated exposure to toxic substances. Jacob had some kidney damage. Emma's growth had been permanently affected, but they were alive, and they were finally safe. Sophia struggled with complicated emotions. She felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. Her therapist worked with her to understand that she was a child, that she had been manipulated by someone she trusted, that the responsibility for what happened rested entirely on her mother. You were brave when you finally told someone, the therapist said. You saved your brother and sister. But Sophia didn't feel brave. She felt sad and confused and angry. Her mother was in prison. Her family was broken. Her siblings were damaged. How was any of that brave? The therapist was patient. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid or sad. It means you did the right thing even though it was hard. You spoke up for Emma and Jacob when they couldn't speak for themselves. Over time, Sophia began to accept this. She began to understand that her mother's actions weren't her fault. That love doesn't require keeping harmful secrets. That protecting her siblings was more important than protecting her mother's image. David struggled too. How had he missed the signs? How had he been so completely deceived? He replayed years of memories, looking for the moments he should have noticed, the red flags he had dismissed or never seen at all. His therapist helped him understand that Marisol had been skilled at deception. People with Munchausen syndrome by proxy were often very convincing. They could fool medical professionals, social workers, even their own spouses. Blaming himself served no purpose, but the guilt remained. He had been working long hours while his wife was poisoning their children. He had trusted without questioning. He had chosen to believe the obvious explanation, that his children were simply unlucky with their health, rather than considering the unthinkable possibility. He channeled his guilt into being the best single father he could be. He reduced his work hours. He attended every therapy appointment with his children. He learned about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, so he could understand what had happened and watch for any lasting effects. He also became an advocate, though quietly. He spoke with other parents whose children had unusual patterns of illness, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Trust your instincts, he would tell them. If something feels wrong, ask questions. Don't assume that just because someone is the mother, she would never harm her children. The medical community also learned from the case. Marisol had visited multiple hospitals and emergency rooms over the years, spreading out the visits so no single medical team saw the full pattern of Emma and Jacob's illnesses. If the hospitals had shared records more efficiently, the pattern might have been spotted sooner. New protocols were established for flagging repeated pediatric admissions. When a child was brought to an emergency room multiple times with similar unexplained symptoms, the system would now alert social services automatically. The alert didn't assume abuse, but it triggered a welfare check to rule it out. These protocols were named Emma's Law in their region. Emma, now 11 years old, didn't know how she felt about having a law named after her. It made what happened to her feel big and public when she wanted it to feel small and private. But her father explained that the law might help other children. What happened to you was terrible, he said. But if we can use it to protect other kids, then something good comes from something bad. Emma thought about this. Okay, she said finally. I guess that's worth it. The support group Marisol had attended, for parents of chronically ill children, struggled after her arrest. The members felt betrayed. They had offered her sympathy and support. They had shared their own struggles. And all along, she had been lying to them, manufacturing the very crisis that gave her membership in their community. Some members felt violated. Others felt foolish. The group nearly dissolved. But the facilitator, a social worker named Karen who had run the group for 8 years, pushed for them to continue. What Marisol did was horrible, Karen said. But it doesn't mean the rest of you don't deserve support. Your children are really sick. Your struggles are real. Don't let her deception make you doubt yourselves. The group continued, though they added new screening procedures. New members had to provide medical documentation. The group worked with pediatricians to verify that children's diagnoses were real. It was sad that such measures were necessary, but Marisol's betrayal had made them essential. In prison, Marisol underwent mandatory therapy. The psychologist working with her tried to help her understand the harm she had caused. Progress was slow. Marisol could intellectually acknowledge that poisoning her children was wrong, but emotionally, she struggled to connect with that truth. When Emma was in the hospital and the doctors were all focused on her, I felt important, she told the psychologist during one session. People asked how I was holding up. They told me I was strong. No one had ever said things like that to me before. And was it worth it? The attention you received compared to the harm you caused. Marisol was quiet for a long time. No, she said finally. But in the moment, I couldn't see that. I just knew I felt good when people noticed me. The psychologist's report noted that Marisol showed some capacity for insight, but remained at high risk for reoffending if she had access to vulnerable individuals. The recommendation was that she never be allowed unsupervised contact with children, even after her release. The parole board, when Marisol became eligible after serving 12 years, denied her release. She would serve her full 20-year sentence. When that ended, she would be monitored closely. She would be prohibited from working in any capacity involving children or vulnerable adults. David had anticipated the possibility that Marisol might someday be released. He had prepared his children for it. Your mother made very bad choices, he told them. She served her punishment according to the law. But that doesn't mean we have to have a relationship with her. You get to decide, when you're adults, whether you want any contact with her. There's no right answer. Whatever you choose will be okay. Sophia knew immediately that she wanted nothing to do with her mother. She hurt Emma and Jacob. She lied to all of us. Why would I want to see her? Emma was less certain. She was young when the abuse happened. Her memories of being sick were fuzzy. In some ways, Marisol was more of an abstract concept than a real person. Maybe someday, she said. But not anytime soon. Jacob was angry. He understood more than Emma about what had been done to him. He had scars, physical and emotional. His kidneys would never work perfectly. He had to be careful about what he ate and drank for the rest of his life. "She did this to me," he said. "I don't forgive her." David supported each of them in their different responses. There was no family mandate to reconcile, no pressure to perform forgiveness for someone else's comfort. The case attracted attention from researchers studying Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Marisol agreed to participate in a study examining the psychology of perpetrators. The researchers hoped to identify early warning signs that might help medical professionals spot the syndrome sooner. The study revealed several commonalities among perpetrators. Many had experienced childhood neglect or had grown up in families where illness brought attention. Many had above-average medical knowledge and comfort navigating healthcare systems. Many were praised as devoted parents or caregivers before the abuse was discovered. None of these factors alone indicated abuse. Plenty of people with medical knowledge and unfortunate childhoods never harmed anyone. But in combination with repeated unexplained illnesses in children under someone's care, they formed a pattern worth investigating. The research led to better training for pediatricians, social workers, and emergency room staff. They learned to recognize when concern for a child's welfare might extend to investigating the caregiver's behavior. Marisol's case became a teaching example. Medical students watched videos of her emergency room visits, learning to spot the subtle signs they had missed at the time. The excessive medical knowledge. The almost theatrical performance of maternal concern. The child who seemed to improve when separated from the parent. It was uncomfortable education. No one wanted to believe that parents could deliberately harm their children for attention. But ignoring that possibility meant more children like Emma and Jacob would suffer unnecessarily. David remarried when the children were in high school. His new wife, Angela, was aware of the family's history from the beginning. She approached her role as stepmother carefully, never trying to replace Marisol, but offering support and care. The children's responses to Angela varied. Sophia was the most welcoming, having been old enough to remember her mother's abuse clearly and appreciate having a genuinely caring adult woman in her life. Emma was cautiously accepting. Jacob was resistant at first, but gradually warmed to Angela when he realized she wasn't trying to force a relationship. Angela never pretended to be their mother. She was their father's wife, someone who cared about them and wanted to support them. That honesty helped. The children had been lied to enough. They valued straightforward truth. When Emma graduated from high school and prepared to leave for college, she wrote an essay about her experience for her college application. The prompt was about overcoming adversity. She wrote about being poisoned by her mother and how it had shaped her decision to study medicine. "I want to be a doctor," she wrote. "Not despite what happened to me, but because of it. I understand what it's like to be a patient. I understand how vulnerable children are. I want to be someone who pays attention, who asks hard questions, who protects kids even when the threat comes from inside their own families." She was accepted to multiple universities. She chose one with a strong pre-med program and a particular focus on pediatrics. Jacob pursued psychology, wanting to understand the kind of mental illness that could lead a parent to harm a child. He wanted to help other survivors of abuse process their trauma. Sophia became a teacher. She wanted to work with children, to be the kind of adult who noticed when something was wrong, who created safe spaces for kids to speak up. All three children transformed their trauma into purpose. It didn't erase what had happened to them, but it gave their suffering meaning beyond just being victimized. David watched his children become adults and felt complicated pride. They had survived. They had thrived despite everything. But they had also lost something that could never be restored: the innocent trust that parents always protect their children. Marisol, serving her sentence, rarely saw her children's accomplishments. They didn't visit. They didn't write. The occasional update came through lawyers managing the final details of the divorce and custody arrangements. She knew Emma was in medical school. She knew Jacob was studying psychology. She knew Sophia was teaching. She told her therapist that she was proud of them. "Are you?" the therapist asked. "Or do you say that because it's what you're supposed to say?" Marisol considered this. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think about them. But I don't feel things the way I'm supposed to. I know I should feel proud. I know I should feel guilty. But mostly I just feel empty." This emptiness, the psychologist noted, was common in severe personality disorders. The capacity to connect emotionally with others was damaged or absent. Marisol could understand intellectually that she should feel certain ways, but the feelings themselves didn't come. This made rehabilitation questionable. How could someone learn not to harm others if they couldn't fully grasp the emotional impact of their actions? The answer, ultimately, was that some people couldn't be rehabilitated in any meaningful sense. They could learn to modify their behavior to avoid punishment. But genuine empathy, genuine remorse, genuine change of character might be beyond their capacity. Marisol would be released eventually. She would be monitored. She would be restricted. But she would be free. And Emma, Jacob, and Sophia would live their lives knowing that somewhere, their mother existed. Not as a real presence in their lives, but as a shadow, a reminder, a reason they worked so hard to be different. The case taught dark lessons about the limits of parental love, about how mental illness could corrupt the most fundamental of bonds, about how children could be seen as objects to serve a parent's needs rather than people deserving protection. But it also taught lessons about resilience, about siblings protecting each other, about the importance of speaking up even when it feels like betrayal, about how trauma could be transformed into purpose. If you've been with me this far in this long journey through these cases, I want to thank you. These stories are heavy. They're difficult, but they're important. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below. We're building something here, a community that doesn't look away from hard truths. As these stories draw to a close, it's important to step back and see what connects them. Each case is different. Different victims, different perpetrators, different circumstances. But threads run through all of them. Lauren Miles died because systems designed to protect privacy couldn't move fast enough to protect life. Her death sparked changes in how emergency data could be accessed. The law that bears her name has saved lives since. But Lauren herself couldn't be saved. That contradiction, improvement built on loss, defines so many of these stories. Elena Vargas died in circumstances that remain disputed. Her family believes her husband arranged her murder. Evidence points in troubling directions, but doesn't quite reach certainty. Her case teaches that justice isn't always clear. Sometimes we must live with ambiguity, with questions that have no satisfying answers. That discomfort is part of truth. Not everything resolves neatly. Mara Whitfield was killed by a stranger who saw opportunity and took it. Her death could have sparked international incidents, could have been twisted into xenophobic narratives. But Detective Kaya's methodical police work cut through speculation and found truth. Mara's case teaches the value of evidence over assumption, of patience over reaction, of doing the quiet work that actually solves crimes rather than the dramatic work that makes headlines. Caleb Norton killed because he believed he had the right to decide who lived and who died. 43 people died under his care before anyone stopped him. The healthcare system that employed him had warning signs, but dismissed them. His case teaches that we must listen when something feels wrong, even when we can't immediately prove it. Institutional trust matters, but blind trust kills. Hannah Reed survived an attempted abduction as a child and waited 30 years for justice. Genetic genealogy finally identified her attacker. Her case teaches that cold cases should never be forgotten, that preserved evidence matters, that technology evolves, and old crimes can be solved with new tools. Justice delayed is still justice. Ethan Rowan killed his wife and daughter rather than accept divorce. His case teaches the deadly reality of domestic violence, how abusers would rather destroy what they claim to love than lose control of it. Clara tried to leave twice. The system, her family, community pressure all pushed her back. She died trying to exercise her fundamental right to leave an unhappy marriage. Nadia Karim was trapped by her abuser's wealth and power. Everyone around her knew. Servants, security, even family. They all knew and said nothing. She was tortured and killed while people who could have helped chose silence. Her case teaches that complicity has costs, that silence enables violence, that protecting powerful people by ignoring their crimes makes us all responsible for the consequences. Marisol Vega poisoned her own children for attention. Her case teaches the darkest lesson of all, that even parental love can be corrupted, that the people meant to protect children can become the greatest threat. Emma and Jacob survived, but they carry the scars of betrayal by the person they should have been safest with. These cases span continents and circumstances, rich and poor, stranger violence and intimate violence, but they share common elements. They all involve systems that failed or worked imperfectly, law enforcement that arrived too late or couldn't prove what they suspected, healthcare systems that missed patterns, social structures that enabled violence through silence or complicity. They all involve ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. None of the victims asked for what happened to them. They were simply living their lives when violence intersected with their paths. They all involve the question of how we respond when terrible things happen. Do we learn? Do we improve? Do we build better systems so the next person has a better chance? And they all involve the people left behind. Families who grieve, siblings who remember, advocates who fight, communities that try to heal. The dead are gone, but their impact remains in the actions of the living. What do we do with these stories? We could be paralyzed by the darkness they represent. The randomness of Lauren's encounter with Marcus Hale, the calculation in Ethan Rowan's murder of his own daughter, the institutional complicity that enabled Caleb Norton's killing spree. But paralysis serves no one. Fear without action is just trauma spreading outward. Instead, these stories should motivate us to pay attention when someone seems trapped, to ask questions when patterns seem wrong, to speak up even when it's uncomfortable, to support systems that protect vulnerable people, to vote for policies that fund shelters and support survivors, to teach our children about healthy relationships and bodily autonomy, to believe people when they say they're afraid. These aren't dramatic actions. They're quiet, daily choices. But they accumulate. They matter. Consider the people in these stories who made a difference. Detective Kaya doing methodical police work rather than chasing dramatic theories. Dr. Chin trusting her instincts that something was wrong even when she couldn't prove it. Amara, the housekeeper who testified truthfully despite knowing it would cost her job. Sophia, the 10-year-old who finally told someone her mother was making her siblings sick. Tarek, the security guard who later dedicated himself to protecting women fleeing violence. None of them were heroes in the traditional sense. They were people doing what should be normal, paying attention, telling the truth, choosing what was right over what was easy. That's what these stories demand of us. Not heroics, just attention, just courage to speak when speaking is uncomfortable, just commitment to building systems that work better than the ones that failed. Lauren's law improving emergency data access. Emma's law flagging repeated pediatric admissions. The Nadia Karim Legal Defense Fund providing representation to survivors with powerful abusers. The support groups and shelters and advocacy organizations that exist because people refuse to let tragedies be meaningless. Each of these emerged from loss. Each represents someone saying, "This cannot happen again," and doing the work to make that statement true. The work is never finished. There will always be another perpetrator, another system failure, another person who falls through the cracks. But there will also always be people fighting back. People who remember. People who insist that victims mattered, that their deaths or suffering should mean something, that we owe them the effort to do better. As you finish listening to these stories, you might feel heavy. That's appropriate. These are heavy stories. They should weigh on us. The weight is what prevents us from looking away, from becoming numb, from accepting violence as inevitable. But alongside the weight, carry something else. Carry the knowledge that change is possible, that survivors like Hannah Reed can build meaningful lives after trauma, that advocates like Clara's sister can turn grief into protective action, that children like Emma, Jacob, and Sophia can transform their abuse into purpose. Carry the commitment to be someone who pays attention, who asks questions, who believes survivors, who supports better systems, who votes for policies that protect vulnerable people, who teaches children about safety and consent, who speaks up when something seems wrong. These aren't grand gestures. They're daily choices. But daily choices accumulate into culture, into norms, into systems that work better. The stories shared here are true. The people were real. The suffering was real. The failures were real. But the changes that emerged were also real. The laws passed. The protocols improved. The awareness increased. The next person in danger had slightly better chances because of lessons learned from the previous person who died. That's not consolation. It doesn't make the deaths okay, but it gives them weight beyond tragedy. It makes them warnings that were heeded, lessons that were learned, catalysts for improvement. Lauren Miles will never know how many people her death saved through improved emergency data access. But people are alive today because police could act faster when someone went missing. That's her legacy. Mara Whitfield will never know how many cold cases were solved using the genetic genealogy techniques refined through cases like hers. But families have answers they wouldn't otherwise have. That's her legacy. Clara and Sophie Rowan will never know how many women successfully left abusive relationships because of improved shelter capacity and legal support. But survivors exist who might not have without those changes. That's their legacy. Nadia Karim will never know how many women the Legal Defense Fund protected from abusers with power and wealth. But those women are safe. That's her legacy. These legacies don't erase the horror of what happened, but they give it meaning. They transform senseless violence into purposeful change. And that's what we owe the dead. To learn, to improve, to build better, to make their suffering count for something beyond just more suffering. As you go about your life after listening to these stories, you'll forget some of the details. That's natural. The mind protects itself from dwelling too long in darkness. But let the core lessons remain. Pay attention. Speak up. Support survivors. Demand better systems. Vote for change. Teach the next generation. Be the person someone in danger can turn to. These are simple actions, but they're the difference between more tragedies and fewer. Between systems that fail and systems that protect. Between silence that enables and voices that intervene. The stories don't end with the final verdicts or the last funeral. They continue in how we choose to live afterward, in what we learn, in what we change, in how we show up for each other. Violence is part of human experience. That's a hard truth. But so is resilience. So is solidarity. So is the capacity to look at horror and say, not again, not if I can help it. That capacity is what separates us from the perpetrators in these stories. They chose violence. We choose differently. We choose to protect, to support, to improve, to remember in ways that honor rather than exploit. These stories were difficult to hear. Thank you for staying with them. Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for carrying the weight of knowing about Lauren, Elena, Mara, the patients Caleb killed, Hannah, Clara, Sophie, Nadia, Emma, Jacob, and all the others whose names represent real lives lost or damaged. Remember them. Let them matter. Let their stories inform how you move through the world. How you respond when someone says they're afraid. How you vote. How you show up. How you teach your children. How you support your community. That's how we fight back against the darkness these stories represent. Not with fear or despair. With purposeful action. With commitment to doing better. With refusal to let tragedy be the end of the story. The dead can't speak for themselves anymore. But we can speak for them. We can demand change in their names. We can build the world they deserve to live in, even though they're gone. That's justice in its truest form. Not just punishment for perpetrators, though that matters, but transformation of systems and culture so fewer people become victims in the first place. These 8 acts, these different stories, they're all chapters in a larger story. The story of how we as a society grapple with violence. How we protect the vulnerable. How we hold perpetrators accountable. How we support survivors. How we learn from failures. It's a story that continues. You're part of it. Your choices, your voice, your actions, they all contribute to what happens next. Make good choices. Speak up. Pay attention. Care about strangers. Support systems that protect people. Vote for policies that prioritize safety. Teach children. Believe survivors. Be the person who notices when something is wrong. These aren't dramatic requests. They're basic. But basic actions, multiplied across communities, create change. That's the final lesson from these stories. Evil succeeds when good people do nothing. But when good people do something, even small things, evil's power diminishes. Be someone who does something. In memory of all those who didn't survive. In support of all those fighting to survive now. In hope for all those who will face danger in the future. Their stories mattered. Make sure yours does too. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being here at the end of this long journey through darkness. Remember to like the video, subscribe to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories, and comment below where you're from and what you thought of these stories. Now go out there and be the person who makes the world a little bit safer, a little bit kinder, a little bit better. Because that's what all of this was really about. Not the darkness, but how we respond to it. Not the violence, but how we work to prevent it. Not the deaths, but how we honor the lives by fighting for the living. Rest in peace to all those whose stories were told here. Your suffering was not in vain. People are learning. Systems are changing. You are remembered. And to those still fighting, still surviving, still afraid, you are not alone. People are paying attention. People are fighting for you. Help is possible. Safety is possible. You deserve both. These stories end here, but the work continues. Be part of it. Good night.